Part 2. Growth. May 12th, 1942. Listen, goddammit, I told you I was going to enlist, and this is the least you could do for me, for Christ's sake. But Max, Sophia pleaded, pronouncing his name Mex. You have a child. You are almost 30 years old. Your family needs you here. If you must leave us, do it. But please don't send this letter. It is a lie. I'm not going to get stuck on some base in Texas while there's a war going on in Europe. You have to sign this letter. It's the only way I'll get in the airborne. The kid will be fine with you, and you can live with Father in St. Louis. You've been bitching about New York for 2 years now. He looked her in the eye. Jesus, I hope this stunt works, he thought. This woman is driving me crazy here. I would have thought you'd be more supportive. After all, it's your relatives that are being slaughtered over there by the Krauts. His final words did it. Sophia Collins hung her head in shame and signed her name to the letter her husband had typed to the War Department. June 2nd, 1942. Collins, this has to be you. Jesus, man, you must have really wanted to get away from that wife of yours. I guess nobody will call you a liar anymore. Private Hemmings had just run into the barracks and now stood by Max Collins's bunk, holding out a folded section of the New York Times. Everyone in basic training had heard the story of how the oldest new recruit on the base had made his wife sign a letter to the War Department demanding they accept her husband for combat duty. Max looked down at the newspaper and laughed out loud. In the goddamn New York Times! I'll be a son of a bitch. He took the paper from the younger man and read the news item. Wife wants father of her child in combat. Begs war dept. To put him in airborne. NY Times staff report. Most women weep at the thought of their husbands going into combat. A Polish-born woman in St. Louis, Missouri, however, has urged the War Department to make sure that her husband gets in the airborne, even though he is 29 and they have a young daughter. The letter was sent to one of the husband's relatives who is connected with the present administration. There it was forwarded to the appropriate department. In part it reads, My husband is strong man and going nuts with war in Europe and nothing can do here. You must take him or not good for me live with here more. My husband must go jump in where fight, not stay at Texas waste of time. The letter goes on to state that the writer's American bomb husband is very concerned for her family in Poland. The couple has not heard from any of them for almost 2 years. It is not often that a wife insists that her husband be accepted into the airborne during wartime. Our prayers are that such demands will soon be unnecessary. Well, I guess I'm not a liar after all, he said with a smile. Some of the other men looked at Max with dubious expressions. All of them were single, and few could imagine wanting to leave wife and child to join the 82nd Airborne. That was just one of the things that differentiated Max Collins from other men. June 9th, 1942. Buell Anvil Jenkins was a short, barrel-chested man with the look of perpetual disgust on his face. At 41, he was old enough to be the father of most of the other enlisted men on the Pensacola Naval Air Station and a few of the officers. A year earlier, he had been the hard-drinking crew chief of an Ohio dirt track team that had aspirations for a shot at the Indianapolis 500. His nickname came from the fact that he built durable cars. My rides don't break, he had often said. They ain't the lightest ones on the track, but they'll be there at the finish if the damn drivers do their part. One day a new mechanic had made a mistake when working on the steering of the team's sprint car, and the driver had crashed into the wall during practice. When Jenkins had discovered the cause of the accident, he had hit the mechanic hard enough to detach his retina, leaving him blind in the left eye. The judge had given Anvil Jenkins the choice of 5 to 10 in Marion, or the opportunity to serve his country in the war that the judge felt the United States was sure to join. Despite his age and lack of prior service, the Navy needed men with Jenkins's exceptional mechanical skills. The mechanic had chosen the second option, but not without considerable deliberation. Jenkins, with his uncommon talent, had quickly become a qualified airframe and power plant mechanic in the Navy, but he hated it. He had the best tools and equipment to work with he had ever seen, but it was wasted. The airplanes, especially the clunky old Stearman biplanes, had engines that were antiquated by race car standards, and the planes themselves were boring. The young flyers were worse prima donnas than the most irritating race car driver he had ever met, and they treated him like he was the garbage man instead of the one who made sure they didn't fall out of the sky. The officers were the worst of all. It was more than he could stand to have to call these young punks sir, and he had gained a reputation for never speaking unless he absolutely had to. One of them was walking towards him now. "Mind if I help with that damaged wingtip, Chief Jenkins? I'm a fair hand with wood. I know it wasn't my student that ground looped it, but I like these planes, and I'm not doing anything else. Can you use some help?" Jenkins was surprised by the request and curious, so he grunted his agreement. Never seen a college boy yet could use his hands, he thought. "Lieutenant Walter Bowman," said the young man, extending his right hand with a smile. The older man shook Bowman's hand without expression and was surprised to feel calluses on it. "Folks call me Anvil, sir," Jenkins replied without explaining. In the next 2 hours they worked quietly together, with the mechanic occasionally giving a brief suggestion to the superior officer. Anvil Jenkins immediately learned that the young pilot had great woodworking skill. His own experience had always been with metal, but Jenkins could see craftsmanship in any area, and the young man obviously had talent. "Why do you like these old Stearmans so much, sir?" the older man finally asked. "I figured you'd much rather be in a fighter." Bowman shrugged and gave an answer the mechanic had never expected. "Fighters are fast, all right, and they're getting better all the time, but there's maneuvers I'd be afraid to try in every one I've ever flown. You can't break a Stearman without flying it into the ground." Anvil Jenkins looked up and Bowman misinterpreted his look of surprise. "Don't believe me? What's the red line speed on a Stearman? It doesn't have one. What's the maneuvering speed? It doesn't have one of those either. You can put a Stearman in a vertical dive with full power from 10,000 feet until it won't go any faster, and then haul back on the stick as hard as you can, and you might black out but you won't break anything. Most planes will have the tail come off in the dive, and the ones that stay together there will have the wings come off in the pullout. I honestly don't believe you can hurt one of these yellow perils while it's still in the air. That's why I like these old yellow open cockpit biplanes," he said with finality. "So this is the guy who bet one of the other instructors that a Stearman wouldn't lose its wings in a maximum G pullout," Jenkins thought. "That was you, huh? Pretty relaxed about the taxpayers' money, ain't you, sir?" The mechanic expected a reprimand for his tone of voice, but the young lieutenant was smiling. Bowman shook his head. "I knew they'd stay on. I even offered to try it without a chute." He winked to let the mechanic know his last statement was a joke. Anvil Jenkins looked at his own powerful arms and then at Bowman's thinner ones. The words that came out of his mouth startled him. "Lieutenant, what if you'd had another 200 pounds in the plane and 2 more arms hauling back on the other stick to pull out faster?" Walter Bowman was already heading for the door. "One way to find out, Anvil." The Stearman's 220 HP Continental engine fired up on the second revolution. As he watched from the front cockpit, Anvil Jenkins could not believe what he was doing. He didn't much like flying straight and level in airplanes, let alone trying to make them disintegrate in midair. His stomach was churning, and they were still on the ground. Walter Bowman gave the engine full power and shoved the stick forward while stepping on the brakes. The tail wheel lifted off the ground, although the plane was stationary. He pulled back slightly on the stick, keeping the biplane balanced on the mains only, and released the brakes. Through judicious use of power, stick, and brakes, Bowman taxied the Stearman out to the end of the runway without ever letting the tail wheel touch the ground. "Damn," thought Jenkins. "Heard about this, but I never saw it. Like a good driver steering with the throttle, guy's having fun with his favorite airplane. There wasn't another pilot on the base who could taxi a Stearman on the mains without putting a prop tip into the asphalt." For a few minutes, Anvil Jenkins began to feel a little better about the whole endeavor. His comfort was short-lived. It seemed to take forever to get the biplane to altitude, and as it climbed slowly, Anvil Jenkins's wish to be on the ground grew stronger. What kind of idiot goes up in an airplane trying to tear it apart? "We don't even know if these chutes will work. Hell, we don't even know if there's really chutes in these backpacks." The plan was looking more and more like insanity with every additional foot of altitude. At 10,000 feet, Walter Bowman pounded on the fuselage with his fist, and the mechanic turned in his seat to see Bowman nod his head. Anvil Jenkins turned forward, took a deep breath, clamped his left hand on the back of his neck, and began to count to 20. Immediately, Bowman shoved the control stick all the way forward. The engine was already at full throttle. The Stearman nosed over sharply, and the two occupants were forced upwards against their harnesses. "Oh, Jesus," Jenkins thought. The mechanic's stomach felt as if it had relocated itself to a spot underneath his breastbone. When they were looking straight at the ground, Walter Bowman eased off on the forward pressure, and the plane stabilized in an attitude that was slightly past vertical. He had explained to the mechanic during the pre-flight that if you aimed the plane straight down, the shape of the wing's airfoil would cause the plane to move forward slightly. To get a true no-lift dive and the absolute maximum speed, the aircraft had to be positioned slightly past vertical so that it would fly straight down. No wonder fighter planes have their tails flutter and disintegrate, Jenkins thought dismally as the shriek of the wind flowing over the flying wires increased in pitch. Anvil Jenkins had never felt such pure terror in his life. The young pilot had told him that it would take 16 seconds for the plane to reach a speed where wind resistance would let it go no faster. Kid must have timed it with a stopwatch, Jenkins thought. Crazy fucker does this shit for fun. Guy said to count to 20 because I'd probably be excited and count fast. The mechanic reached a count of 20, but the pitch of the screaming wires was still changing. No way this college boy is going to tell me I jumped the gun, he thought grimly. He stopped counting but kept his hand behind his head. When the tremendous noise in his ears stopped changing in pitch, he raised his left elbow slightly to signal the young man in back, and pulled his arm down into the cockpit where his left hand joined his right one on the control stick. Anvil Jenkins pulled the control stick towards his gut with all his might. His upper body was thick and powerful, and at the moment he was charged with more adrenaline than he had ever been in his life. Walter Bowman's hands were already on his own control stick. When he saw Anvil's hand drop from behind his neck, he tensed his stomach muscles as hard as he could, and then hauled back on the controls with all his strength. Just as he started, he felt the older man's efforts join his own, and the stick moved. Backwards more quickly than he had ever experienced. The elevator was forced against the stops, a feat Bowman had only accomplished at lower speeds before, and the controls would move no farther. New sounds emanated from the screaming aircraft as the atmosphere was forced in a new path over the tail's control surfaces. Bowman had experienced high G-forces before, but none like this. His body pressed into the seat as if it weighed over 1,800 pounds. The aircraft was almost level and passing through 4,000 feet. Walter Bowman noticed that his own peripheral vision was diminishing, but Jenkins was still helping hold the controls against the stops. Bowman smiled into the horrendous wind blast. The G-forces were dragging the flesh of his cheeks and lips downwards, making the young man's face look like something out of a carnival funhouse. Suddenly the controls got much heavier in Walter Bowman's hands. Anvil Jenkins had released his pull on the stick, and Bowman knew that Jenkins had either lost his nerve or blacked out. Positive G-forces drove the blood out of the brain, and could cause unconsciousness at modest levels if the passenger was a neophyte, or in anyone if the forces were high enough. It was a lesson Walter demonstrated to each new cadet on his first flight by pulling enough GS to put the new student out. It taught respect for the dangers of flight. It also caused the young lieutenant to be referred to as Blackout Bowman by his contemporaries on the base. Walter Bowman relaxed back pressure, reduced power, and was prepared to let the biplane fly itself into level equilibrium when suddenly the stick jerked forward in his hand and the airplane nosed over again into a dive. Bowman pulled back as hard as he could, but the stick wouldn't budge. He immediately realized what had happened. The unconscious man had slumped forward onto his own control stick. The G-forces had caused Jenkins' heavy body to compress the seat pack emergency chute enough to make the harness loose. Bowman's chute pack, after daily high G maneuvers, had already been as solid as a rock. The pilot knew that he couldn't possibly budge the other man by pulling on the stick, so he did the only logical thing. Bowman pushed the controls forward to steepen the descent. As negative Gs raised the unconscious man's body off of the stick, Walter pushed his own control hard against his left knee. The biplane started to roll, and when it was inverted, Bowman leveled the wings. The airplane was now flying, upside down at a speed of about 170 knots, descending in a steep dive at a rate of over 3,000 feet per minute. Walter pushed the stick forward, raising the nose until the biplane was flying straight and level. The pilot and the mechanic were suspended in their harnesses, blood rushing to their heads. The unconscious mechanic's arms flailed over his head in the windstream. Walter flew the plane upside down on a heading towards the airfield and waited for the older man to regain consciousness. When Anvil Jenkins came to, he immediately realized he was about to die. I'm falling out of the plane, he screamed silently to himself. It's upside down and about to crash. The mechanic frantically grabbed the edges of the cockpit to hold himself in. I'm strapped in. Got to unbuckle the harness to bail out. Oh Christ, the ground's right there, and where's the release? I didn't practice this. Where's the fucking harness quick release? Before he could get a grip on the quick release mechanism, the plane miraculously righted itself and flew normally. Jenkins held onto the sides of the open cockpit with a death grip, hyperventilating and waiting for the plane to try to kill him again, when he remembered where he was and who he was with. He turned in his seat to look behind him and saw the smiling young face of Lieutenant Bowman, who was giving him the thumbs-up signal. Waves of relief swept over him, coupled with stark horror that he was the one who had suggested this adventure. The trip back to the base was uneventful, if you ignored the snap roll that Walter Bowman executed on final approach at an altitude of 300 feet. When the plane finally rolled to a stop on the flight line, Anvil Jenkins climbed down out of it on shaking legs. The mechanic resisted the overpowering impulse to lie down on the asphalt and hug the earth. He could feel his heart rate slowly returning to normal. Bowman was smiling at him. You've got a hell of a set of arms, mister. We bottomed out the elevator with the airspeed indicator pegged. Guy actually looks happy, Jenkins realized with astonishment. Better get my sorry ass together, for he thinks I should be wearing diapers. What'd we pull, sir? Jenkins asked. The mechanic noticed that it didn't bother him so much to address the young officer properly. Anybody's guess. My peripheral vision was closing in, so I was getting close to a blackout, even with this damn thing on the last notch. Lieutenant Bowman unzipped his flight suit to expose a thick leather harness that compressed his abdomen like a corset, which he then began to unbuckle. The mechanic looked at him quizzically. Had it made. Holds your guts in on high G maneuvers, keeps you from blacking out as soon. I pulled 8 with it before, in a plane with a meter, and didn't feel anything like what we got today. I'd say we saw at least 10. The mechanic shook his head in amazement and reached over to pluck at one of the flying wires, expecting it to have lost some tension. It thrummed like the string on a bass guitar. Bowman tied the plane down and the two men headed back to the hangar. The mechanic was thinking, awful strong airframe, but a little shy on power, ain't it, sir? The man ventured, remembering how long it had taken the 220 horsepower Continental to get them to 10,000 feet. No need to buy expensive engines and burn twice the fuel just to train cadets, Bowman replied realistically. I might could do something about that, sir, the older man found himself saying. He was starting to feel eager about something for the first time since joining the Navy. Bowman turned towards him and brightened visibly. That's right. You build race car engines. He frowned and shook his head. I think the brass would come down hard if they found out you modified an engine in a trainer. It wouldn't be worth it for a few more horsepower. Anvil Jenkins let out the first laugh anyone on the base had ever heard him utter. A few more horsepower? Hell, I ain't talking about trying to soup up one of them worthless Continental stem winders. That thing was out of date the day the first crankcase came out of the foundry. This ain't the racetrack with some damn rule book to get around. I got me a wrecked SNJ sitting back of the hangar. Think you could fly that plane of yours with a real engine in front of you? Sir? Walter Bowman was not a man who was easily surprised, but his jaw dropped. The SNJ was a heavy, all-metal trainer. It was powered by a Pratt & Whitney Wasp 9-cylinder radial that produced 600 horsepower. You want to put a Wasp in a Stearman? Bowman was incredulous, but thrilled at the same time. What about the CG? He was referring to the change in the center of gravity the heavier engine would make, but already he was thinking of the solution. The plane's got such big control surfaces, moving the CG forward would probably make it more stable, and we could probably relocate some components aft, section the front of the fuselage. He was imagining his airplane with almost triple the power. Damn, Jenkins, the thing would climb like a rocket. What else would you want to change, sir? Jenkins had his head cocked and was eyeing the young man speculatively. A wish list? All 4 wings, first of all, for better roll. Maybe aileron spades, too, to reduce control pressure. Shorten the wings, even. Shorter throw on the stick, too, if we don't need as much leverage anymore. Lighter gear if cadets aren't going to fly it. His voice trailed off. Hell, what am I saying? We'd both face court-martial if you start sawing on one of the trainers on the flight line. Anvil Jenkins looked at the young man with an evil grin, and for a moment he forgot who he was talking to. Those college boys may run most of this base, but I run the maintenance shop. I got me a steerman in the back with a cracked block and some gear damage, and if I say it ain't fit to return to service with students, then it ain't, and that's that. And I got me that wrecked SNJ, and before you tell me the base might need it for parts, let me tell you that we got another wrecked one behind the south hangar, and if these cadets keep slamming them into the runway like they've been doing, we're going to have another wrecked one pretty soon. And the one spare part we don't seem to need is engines, 'cause that Pratt & Whitney is a pure D anvil. Unless I start draining all the oil out of them before putting them out on the flight line, we're likely to end up with nothing but busted airframes with 100% engines by the time this damn war is over. Now, you got you a ride what won't bust less you run it into something, and I reckon you ain't gonna do that, but it's got no steam. He spat on the tarmac. Well, if you want to put together a steerman that'd make a Boeing engineer's hair stand on end, and you want to do most of your own woodwork, 'cause I'm a hammerman myself, I got me a machine shop Wilbur Shaw would kill for, and I'm sick of seeing it used on nothing but these airy planes what look like they was taken to a demolition derby by drunk kids in short pants. Lieutenant Bowman was astonished. He did not know it, but he had just heard the longest continuous utterance Anvil Jenkins had issued since his forced enlistment in the Navy the previous year. He was at a loss for words, so he looked at his watch absent-mindedly. I've got to check in. When can I look at that Earman? I'll be in the shop all night, sir. Come by after dinner if you want. I will, the young lieutenant said, nodding slowly as he turned to leave. He was still shaking his head when one of the other instructors hailed him near the officers' club. Didn't I see you with Jenkins by the hangar? What were you doing with that sour old prick? I'm not sure, Bowman said with a puzzled look on his face. I think I may have created a monster. August 6, 1942. Both of you, on your feet, you will come with us. The four men in uniform looked terrifying to the young couple. But, no talking. The soldier in charge looked at Irwin. You have 1 minute to pack a bag. You, he said, addressing Irwin Mann's 23-year-old wife Magda, will not need anything else. Now, he commanded. At least they won't be detaining her overnight, Irwin thought. As if in a daze, the young grocer retrieved a battered case from under their bed and hastily put some clothes and toiletries in it. He wanted to find out where they were taking him, but the four soldiers with submachine guns did not look as though they would be agreeable to questions right now. As they left the small shop, Irwin took out his keys to lock up. One of the soldiers snatched them from his hand. We will take care of your shop for you, he said in a tone that invited no argument. Irwin and Magda, flanked by the four soldiers, walked down Bahnhofstrasse. As they came up to the edge of the railway station, Irwin Mann's heart sank. There were scores of Jews being herded along towards a freight train. All of them were men. I believe your husband has a ticket for this one, Frau Mann, said one of the soldiers, and his three companions broke out into raucous laughter. Two of them started to lead the girl away. Wait, you can't. The rifle butt hit him squarely in the solar plexus, and Irwin Mann was immediately doubled over in agony. He could neither talk nor breathe. Don't worry, Hermann, one of the two departing soldiers said over his shoulder. I assure you that your wife will not be bored. I am sure that our fine officers will keep your little Polish cunt occupied in ways you have never imagined. The others laughed as they picked Irwin up and threw him bodily through the open door of the freight car. Irwin! Magda screamed as the freight car door clanged shut. They would never see each other again. August 8th, 1942. Irwin Mann could still not believe it. The day before yesterday, I was working in my produce and grocery shop in Danzig, he thought. Now I'm packed like a piece of livestock into a vile-smelling railway car. The train had made several stops to pick up more citizens, but no one had been permitted to get off. There were now so many of them in such a small space that if anyone fainted from fatigue, he would be held erect by the closeness of the others around him. The passengers' requests to be allowed to relieve themselves had been ignored. The oppressive heat generated by so many human bodies packed together made the inevitable result all the more nauseating. Irwin knew they were being taken to Warsaw. The men in the freight car had talked freely at first. Then, as their confinement in the darkness of their current prison had continued, Irwin had seen their spirit disintegrate. Now, no one is speaking, Irwin thought. Many of these men have much more education than I, and are in well-respected professions. Their demoralization was overwhelming. Irwin, too, felt the crushing reality of what was happening to him build on itself, but he was younger than most of those around him, and he had not yet lost his young man's unerring faith in what the future held in store for him. The train finally arrived at its ultimate destination. The air brakes filled the cars with a cacophony of hisses, squeals, and sounds of creaking metal as they gradually dragged over 1,200 tons of freight train to a halt. Immediately, the passengers heard the sounds of soldiers pounding on the latches to open the freight doors on the sides of the cars. When the doors swung open, all the people inside squinted in the bright sunlight as they stumbled and fell out of the cars. Irwin was stronger and quicker than most of the others, and he escaped the wrath of the soldiers who stood to the sides of each freight car door, urging the captives out. "Move! You are delaying the others." A soldier was prodding a man of about 60 with the bayonet attached to the muzzle of his rifle. The man had fallen from the freight car to the gravel and wrenched his ankle. The soldier kicked him in the thigh. "Jewish filth, you have soiled yourself! Animals!" He spat on the fallen figure and turned to vent his anger on another captive. When Irwin Mann's eyes adjusted to the bright daylight, he was amazed at what he saw. The railroad yard appeared to be at the edge of a city. A high wall extended as far as he could see between where he stood and the city itself. At an opening in the wall, Nazi soldiers armed with submachine guns stood guard. "Can this wall extend all the way around the city?" he asked himself in disbelief. "They have transformed all of Warsaw into a prison camp." "Your things are being unloaded now. Take them and get moving." Irwin looked in the direction of the soldier's gaze and saw some shabby-looking Jews haphazardly throwing suitcases and duffel bags off of one of the freight cars. "Get going!" the soldier commanded, and to emphasize his point he jabbed at the people nearest him with his bayonet, eliciting 2 screams. Irwin followed the others towards the pile of baggage. He noticed a few women among the group. None of them were under 35. A feeling of dread ran through him as he located his bag and followed some of the others towards the gap in the wall. When they passed through it, Irwin Mann saw that his suspicions had been accurate. They were in the city of Warsaw, and the wall extended around all of it that he could see. There were other drab-looking people off in the distance. The entire tableau before him was one of utter despair. "Now what?" asked an elderly man standing near Irwin Mann. He was addressing no one in particular. "I think we're on our own," Mann said as he started walking into the city. August 10th, 1942. "More right rudder! More right rudder!" Lieutenant Walter Bowman yelled into the funnel. Hell, Bowman thought, he can't hear me any better than any of the others could. The instructor looked at the back of his student's head and felt foolish for even trying to use the ridiculous intercom. The Stearman biplane, in Walter Bowman's very biased view, was one of the finest creations on Earth, but the funnel and tube communication system was a joke. Bowman unbuckled his harness and prepared to effect the cure that had unintentionally become one of his trademarks. Grabbing the edge of the cockpit with his left hand and the semicircular cutout in the trailing edge of the upper wing with his right, Bowman lifted himself to a crouched position in the hole in the fuselage in which he had been sitting a second before. With a fluid movement that was the result of having performed this particular maneuver many times in the past, he swung his right leg over the edge of the cockpit and planted his foot on the wing root of the right lower wing. It took serious effort to combat the strong wind blast provided by both the plane's 80-knot forward speed and the prop wash of the big propeller. Using the bracing wires and the wing strut for handholds, Walter Bowman put all his weight on his right foot, pulled his left leg out of the rear cockpit, and took 2 more steps into the wind blast until he stood on the part of the wing next to the front cockpit hole in the fuselage. The student snapped his head to the right, and his eyes grew wide inside his flight goggles. He had been rendered unconscious on his first flight with this insane man, and he had been told by his fellow cadets to expect this current atrocity, but it still had not prepared him for the sight of his instructor standing on the wing of the airplane that he, and he alone, was now flying. Bowman held the edge of the front cockpit with his left hand and a bracing wire with his right. He leaned over and put his mouth next to the cadet's right ear. "You've got the nose too high. We're still in a climb, and that's why we don't have any speed," he yelled. He let go of the edge of the cockpit and reached in to tap the face of the altimeter for emphasis. "I told you on the ground to level off at 5,000. Look." The student, momentarily horrified that his instructor had let go one of his handholds, looked at the altimeter. The clock-like hands showed that they were at 5,200 feet. Bowman grabbed the control stick and said, "I've got it. Keep your feet on the rudders." He pushed the stick forward until the plane was flying straight and level. His position on the side was an awkward one from which to try to exert force on the controls, and it took considerable effort. The airspeed indicator started to climb gradually. He pushed harder, lowering the nose further, and the big steerman began a slight descent. Keeping an eye on the altimeter, he leveled the plane at 5,000 feet. "Hold it there," he commanded. He released his grip on the stick when he saw that his student had control of it. "Do you see the position of the horizon?" The student nodded his assent. "That's what straight and level looks like. Try to remember it. Now," he shouted, tapping the face of another gauge on the panel. "Look at your slip and skid indicator." The device he was pointing to was a curved, fluid-filled tube, aligned like a frown. A black ball floated in the clear liquid, somewhat closer to the right end of the tube than the left. "You need more right rudder. Step on the ball, remember?" The student nodded vigorously as he increased pressure on the right rudder pedal. The black ball drifted a bit left of center as the cadet pushed a little too hard with his right leg, then settled in the proper center position when he relaxed pressure slightly. "That's good," Bowman yelled. "After I get back in, I want you to show me a 360 to the left and then one to the right, staying at 5,000 feet. The student nodded, his eyes looking at the relationship of the horizon with the leading edge of the top wing. Bowman tapped the slip and skid indicator once more for emphasis. "Make sure your turns stay coordinated while you're in your bank, then head for home." He patted the cadet on the shoulder, climbed back into his own cockpit, buckled his safety harness, and flexed the muscles in his feet and calves to relax them. The student looked over his shoulder and saw his instructor nod his head. He rolled the biplane into a 30-degree bank to the left and held it there. "The nose is a little low and we're going to lose a little altitude," Bowman thought. "His rudder control is spot on, though." Walter didn't need to look at his own instrument panel to judge the young man's efforts. When a turn and bank was properly coordinated, the people in the plane didn't feel their bodies pushed to the outside or falling to the inside of the turn. Walter's favorite demonstration of proper control coordination when he was in an enclosed airplane was to set a water glass on the top of the instrument panel and fill it from a pitcher without spilling a drop. This would be no great feat, except that Walter Bowman did it while making the airplane perform a barrel roll. It was a demonstration that had won him not only the respect of the other instructors on the base, but also quite a bit of their pocket money as well. As the student rolled out of the left-hand 360-degree turn, he saw that he had lost almost 100 feet of altitude. Pushing the stick to the right to roll into his right-hand turn, he increased back pressure on it to raise the nose slightly. His instructor smiled. "This kid's going to be one of the better ones." Walter Bowman never lost sight of the fact that in an all too short time his pupils were going to be using their new skills in a much more hostile environment than clear skies over the coast of the Florida Panhandle. When Ensign Taylor Lowell rolled the wings level on his original heading, he looked at his altimeter. It read a fraction over 4,900 feet. His second 360 had been made holding a constant altitude. Ensign Lowell felt a surge of pride that surprised him with its intensity. The fear of not measuring up that accompanied the excitement of flying dropped down a notch. With a sixth sense about such matters, Lieutenant Bowman felt the difference in the young man's attitude. When they turned back towards the base, he elected to let his student fly it all the way into the landing pattern before taking over the controls for the landing itself. On the way back to the airfield, the big biplane felt a little more steady, its heading a little more consistent, and the thrum of its engine just a little more smooth. "How'd the babes in the woods do today, Blackout?" Lieutenant Homer Tapscott was grinning at his friend and fellow flight instructor. "I can see you're going to have to requisition another flight suit. The Navy doesn't tolerate shoddy uniforms." Bowman looked down and saw that the bottom of his right pants leg had finally become frayed from high speed flapping in the wind. The right ones always seemed to wear through first, he thought. The supply clerk must be getting used to seeing me every 10 days or so. Any day that ends with the bird still airworthy and free from vomit is a success, Bowman said pleasantly. Walter Bowman was the only instructor at Pensacola whose students had never damaged an airplane but he had not been able to prevent a few of them from throwing up. The kids they're sending us seem to get younger and greener every month. We're just getting old. Lieutenants Tapscott and Bowman were each 26. I'm done for the day. Join me at the OC for a bit. Grab a Coke. Tapscott knew his friend never drank alcohol. Walter Bowman's smile was small, but it showed excited anticipation. No, I heard Anvil had some good news for me. I think I'll go take a look at his welds. He turned his back and started to walk towards the hangars. He could guess what Tapscott's reaction would be. He got the mount finished? The hell with the officers' club. I gotta see this. Homer Tapscott broke into a trot to catch up with his friend. The big Stearman looked considerably different than it had several months before. The wings were 21 inches shorter on each side, and the upper ones had ailerons just like the lowers. The wing struts, handholds, and step had all been reshaped to make them more streamlined. Everywhere that the biplane had been square and angular, it was now more rounded. The landing gear was lighter and slightly taller to compensate for the larger prop that the craft would be using, and the main wheels were covered with beautiful, hand-formed aluminum wheel pants with flawless welds. Just like making little bitty sprint car bodies, Anvil Jenkins had proclaimed. The biggest change, however, was in front of the firewall, where once had been a 6-cylinder Continental engine displacing 540 cubic inches, now sat a 9-cylinder Pratt & Whitney radial with 1,320 inches of displacement. Jenkins saw the two men looking at the engine and walked over to them. Got it back further than we thought, Lieutenant. Relocated a couple things on the firewall that were in the way. Walter Bowman saw that this was a gross understatement and got her snugged all in tight. B. Stronger that way, too. Engine won't have as much leverage with a mount a couple inches shorter than the one came off it. Bowman examined the handmade engine mount. It was a beautifully formed piece made of myriad short sections of steel tubing expertly welded together. Every part of it had been triangulated. There was not a single bend in any section of tubing. It did not look heavy, but Bowman knew he would have to crash the plane to make the engine mount flex. Been thinking about what kind of prop to use. I figure you want her to climb like a bandit, sir, so we need one with a flat pitch if you're going to spin her up 500 revolutions per minute. More than what you're turning now. Maybe have to have one What? Exclaimed Lieutenant Tapscott in disbelief. Turn a Wasp 500 over Redline? You'll blow it up. Walter Bowman smiled. I told Anvil I didn't want to exceed factory stress levels. He lightened all the reciprocating parts and cut down the counterweights on the crank to balance it. We got 3 of the slider rule geniuses in artillery to give us a new redline based on the new recip weights. They all 3 came up with the same number independently. Should run all day at the new setting. Tapscott was speechless. Shave the heads, too, along with cleaning up the ports. I think the engineers at Pratt were maybe planning to sell these engines to some Mexicans who'd run them on creosote. Gotta drink grape juice now, but hell, Lieutenant, we got plenty of that. Anvil Jenkins was explaining how he had raised the engine's compression ratio and increased its ability to consume the air-fuel mixture that fed it. Aviation fuels were color-coded by grade, with the highest octane, 115 145ths, having a purple tint that earned it the nickname grape juice. What about torque factor? It had been some time since Homer Tapscott had ventured into the hangar, and he was awed by what had taken shape there. Jenkins smiled. We've been wondering about that, sir. Made the rudder about 20% bigger, but I figure that old Pratt's going to be kicking out at least 800, maybe 850. Don't think Lieutenant Bowman's going to want to use full throttle on takeoff, or he might end up on his back. And I suggest nobody get in an ass-kicking contest with him in a few months. If he flies this bird as much as I expect, he's going to have the strongest fucking right leg on this airbase, sir. The mechanic was referring to a phenomenon called P-factor, where in a climb, the right side of an airplane's propeller had more thrust than its left, necessitating the pilot's use of additional right rudder. The effect was increasingly pronounced with more powerful engines. It's going to be airworthy that soon? Tapscott was amazed. Seems like the green ones are banging up the trainers less often these days, sir, and the kids in the shop here are kind of itchy to see if this thing will fly. They got kind of a different attitude about their job since they seen that ass over tea kettle thing the lieutenant here did last week. We better get back, Homer. I've got ground school to teach. It's looking great, Jenkins. It's an anvil, sir, the mechanic said with a grin. The 2 officers returned smiles and departed the hangar. Anvil Jenkins's comment about the junior mechanics referred to the fact that Walter Bowman, in his endless quest to find out what a steerman could do, had discovered a flight maneuver no one on the base had ever seen, and had performed it for the base on July 4th. In virtually all maneuvers by aerobatic aircraft, although the airplane might be pointed straight up, straight down, on its side, or upside down, it is still flying. That is to say, the plane is still responding to control inputs because at least one of the movable control surfaces still has air flowing smoothly over it. In a stall, the wings quit flying, but the rudder and elevator are still effective and can be used to get the wings providing lift again. In a spin, one wing is not flying, so the plane corkscrews down, but the rudder and elevator are again still effective and can break the plane out of the spin. A snap roll is merely a horizontal spin while flying straight and level. It is performed by forcing one wing to quit flying by abrupt use of elevator and rudder, then reversing the process so that both wings provide lift again after the aircraft has made one revolution. Even in a tailslide where the plane is flown straight up and allowed to fall back, air is flowing backwards over the elevator and rudder, and moving either of these controls will flip the plane over to where it is flying forward again. Walter Bowman had discovered that it was difficult, but possible, to make a steerman quit flying altogether. With little fuel, and with some lead weights firmly bolted to the inside of the plane's fuselage behind the rear cockpit, the aircraft's center of gravity was past its aft safe limit as determined by Boeing engineers. In this configuration, Bowman found that if he initiated a climbing inverted snap roll at a higher than average rate of speed and held the controls in that position rather than reversing them to end the maneuver, the steerman would tumble. To an observer on the ground, the maneuver looked the same as if a toy metal airplane, designed only to sit on the mantel, had been grabbed by the back end and thrown like a tomahawk across the sky. No two performances of this maneuver were quite the same. The plane tumbled randomly. After 2 or 3 somersaults, the huge amount of drag produced by the large wing and fuselage surfaces slowed the steerman to where it started to fall out of the sky. When it did, it would enter a spin, either an upright one or inverted. These are both standard acrobatic maneuvers from which any accomplished acrobatic pilot can recover. The tumble that preceded them, however, was a new one to everyone on the base. The pilots at Pensacola had taken to calling the maneuver a B-squared, math notation for double B, which stood for Blackout Bowman. The young lieutenant did not think he had invented something no one else had ever done before. He just couldn't find anyone who had ever heard of such a maneuver, let alone seen it. 30 years later, the maneuver would be common at air shows around the country. It would be called a lomchevak, a Czechoslovakian term given the maneuver by a Czech pilot who had mastered it in the early 70s in a Zlin. The word has no literal English translation. Loosely interpreted, it means, I have drunk too much wine and my head feels awful. Acrobatic pilots after 1972 would often refer to it as the hunky headache. The airshow circuit pilots who would employ the lomchevak in their repertoire in future decades would perform it in purpose-built competition acrobatic machines such as the Zlin, Pitt Special, Kristen Eagle, and the Laser. None would use a steerman, which became a staple of air shows, but would be generally relegated to wing-walking acts. Few pilots 50 years after WYB would trust the structural integrity of a plane originally built for $1,500 in 1929 to endure the stresses created by a lomchevak. Fewer still would bolt lead to a plane built in 1929 and move the CG aft of its design limit just to see how much caution the original engineers had exercised. And not a single one of them would have Walter Bowman's absolute certainty that a steerman could do anything, if only you were good enough. September 12, 1942. Okay, feet together, hands up on the risers, knees bent slightly, get ready to drop and roll. Max Collins ran through everything he had been taught and had practiced in jump training. There was one thing Collins could not do, however, and that was change the fact that he was 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 203 pounds in his underwear. The jump master had warned Collins time and again that he was going to hit hard under a 24-foot canopy while carrying 40 pounds of gear. The other men in his unit were a good 40 to 50 pounds lighter, and for the first time in his life, Max Collins wished he were smaller. He had made 31 jumps and had felt every one of them. This was his 32nd. Wind moving me back and right, okay, twist a little, and Max Collins' feet hit the ground just a little sooner than he had anticipated, and he had not yet tensed his ankles as he had been taught to do. As he slammed into the hard-packed earth, there was a pop that he felt all the way up to his knee. Shit! Broken ankle, he thought instantly, and cursed himself for failing to remain vigilant. He rolled on the ground and came up on his one good leg, hopping towards the canopy to keep the line slack so the chute wouldn't drag him. Damn, thought Collins, for what would not be the last time. Then another thought filled his mind, and he focused on it. I am going to heal, and I am not going to let this put me on the sidelines. By God, I'm not. April 17th, 1943. Irwin Mann stared at Stern, waiting for him to speak. The older man's eyes were fixed on 4 handguns which lay on a dilapidated table in front of him. He doesn't look happy, Irwin thought. And little wonder. 4 well-worn pistols in several calibers, with only a handful of ammunition that may not even fire. Not much to bet our lives on, after his speech last night. Irwin Mann looked around at the others. The faces of many of the men showed unmistakable signs of defeat. Fear was there also. It hung like a noxious fog in the crowded room. The penalty for having a gun was death, and each man there knew it. None of these men had been soldiers. None had been policemen. Not one had ever himself owned a firearm. I doubt any of us know how to use them, even if they do work, Irwin thought grimly. No surprise Stern doesn't know what to say. We are doomed, came a voice from the group. The older man looked up but could not tell who had spoken. We are certainly doomed if we do nothing, Stern said. The Nazis have been shipping our people away by the trainload. I can scarcely believe that we were so blind as to think it could have been to someplace better. But maybe it is someplace better. They say it is because of the overcrowding here. The speaker's voice had a desperate sound. Stern fixed him with a penetrating stare, and Irwin saw that Stern was acting as a leader should, diffusing the feeling of hopelessness that threatened to kill their resistance movement before it had made even a symbolic gesture. Are you volunteering to go on the next train? Or are you eager to promise the Nazis you will help them fill the train with others headed for this better place, if they let you stay here? The man turned his face away in shame at Stern's question. The reality the men in the group faced was so overwhelming, no one dared speak of it. The decision to implement the final solution had been made by the German High Command in early 1942. The residents of the ghetto did not know that exactly, but they were well aware that railroad cars were leaving Warsaw every few days with hundreds of their people. It was impossible for them not to piece together what was happening. Nazi soldiers hinted broadly at the fitting end their leaders had devised for the subhuman creatures whose existence they had been forced to endure for so long. At the Battle of Stalingrad in late 1942, Germany's advance to the east had been stopped in its tracks. Almost 1 million German troops had perished in that battle alone. Everyone knew that it was just a matter of time before the Nazis were defeated, so some residents of the ghetto were doing their best to get along with their captors, trying to stay alive long enough for the liberating forces to arrive. The problem was that keeping oneself alive meant helping the Nazis round up others for shipment out of the city, and the shipments were getting larger and more frequent. Some of the Jews had decided that they now had to fight, regardless of the odds. A young man named Mordecai Anielewicz had called upon others in the ghetto to mount a resistance effort. Several men with influence in the ghetto had taken his idea to heart, and had assembled their own groups. Stern was one such person, and he was the reason Irwin Mann and the others were gathered that evening in the small room. Stern looked away from the man he had reprimanded and returned to the subject of their meager arsenal. We have done well to amass these weapons, he said, indicating the guns that lay on the table, and with them we have a chance. You are forgetting, my good friends, that we have many, many more weapons available to us now, all with plenty of the proper ammunition and all in good condition. Exactly right, Irwin Mann thought as he looked around at the skeptical, tired faces all but devoid of hope. And Irwin Mann smiled. It was a genuine smile, full of comprehension and expectation, and Stern saw it instantly. Let me have the revolver, Irwin said when he saw Stern looking at him. It is least likely to malfunction. I will get more weapons for us. All heads swiveled to look at the one who had spoken. Your name, young man? I am here in Warsaw because my name was known to those who wished to exterminate us. My wife was taken from me. I pray that she is dead. This brought a gasp from some in the group. I fear that if she is not, he went on, she may be in a place where she wishes that she were. I am not known here, I have no friends, and I will make none. But if you will give me that revolver, I will bring you more weapons. You believe that one of us might somehow betray you by knowing your name? One of the older men in the group was speaking. His eyes were narrow slits, and his seething anger was quite obvious. I believe that many things will happen which we cannot now imagine, man said levelly. I know that I can scarcely believe what I have already seen with my own eyes. There is no benefit in any of us having information about each other that we do not need. He looked at Stern. The old man nodded and handed him the revolver. I asked the Lord to send us a sign. He has done so, Stern said, nodding at Irwin. No one spoke. All eyes were on Irwin Mann as he slid the gun into the side pocket of his tattered, filthy overcoat and briskly walked away from the group. In a few moments he had vanished up one of the alleys and was gone. Irwin Mann's heart was racing. The bravado he had shown in front of the others had been utter fabrication. He had been terrified that his voice would crack with the fear that was churning in his guts. He knew nothing about guns. He recalled that he had once heard that revolvers were more reliable and easier to use than the other kind of gun, and had suddenly found himself blurting out his demand for the weapon. In truth, he was not sure he knew how to make the gun fire at all. The young grocer from Danzig had one tremendous asset, however, and it was what had given him the courage to seize the opportunity to control his destiny. Irwin Mann was a very analytical person who had an innate understanding of machinery. He let this fact give him comfort as he stepped through the doorway of an abandoned building and walked over to a broken window. With shuffling motions of his feet, Irwin used his ragged boots to sweep the glass and debris away from beneath the window and clear a spot so that he could lie down. He wanted both privacy and decent light. He needed to be able to examine the gun and figure out exactly how it worked before taking any action. He had a plan in mind, but it did not allow for hesitation or uncertainty. The young Jew took the revolver out of his coat pocket. He knew enough to keep the barrel pointed away from any part of his body and his fingers away from the trigger. He did not know how hard you needed to press on the trigger to make the gun fire. He did not think it logical that a slight touch would discharge the weapon, but he had no intention of doing anything rash to find out. Irwin turned the weapon in his hands. He knew the fat bulge in the center was the cylinder. It held the ammunition. 6 shots. He could see the cartridges even though the gun was closed up and ready to fire. The back edges of the brass cartridge cases could be seen through the space between the back of the cylinder and the chassis of the gun. Was chassis the right word? He wasn't sure. Irwin looked at the front of the gun, not letting the barrel point straight at his head but rather angling away from it. His heart jumped when he saw the dull white gray of oxidized lead visible in the 4 chambers of the cylinder that were not in the top or bottom position, and he was struck with a thrilling thought. If a gun like this is pointed at you, and you are dosed to it, you can tell if it's loaded or not. He was determined to figure out how to take the ammunition out, so that he could better understand how the gun worked. His attention was drawn to the gun's hammer. It stuck up on the back and had grooves machined or filed into it. They looked like they were there to provide a non-slip grip for a finger or thumb. He started to pull the hammer back, and as he did so, he saw the cylinder start to turn. He realized he was starting to cock the weapon, and that was something he did not want to do. He slowly lowered the hammer to its original position. The cylinder stopped turning. He saw that there was no longer a chamber lined up with the barrel of the gun. Irwin touched the cylinder and realized that it now would turn freely. He rotated it with his finger, and when one of the chambers in it containing a cartridge was lined up with the barrel, the cylinder locked into position with an audible click. Mann realized he could no longer turn the cylinder with his hand. I have to unload this weapon, he thought. He looked at what he had believed was the gun's safety catch. It was a serrated rectangular button on the left side of the gun. He pushed on it. Nothing happened. It was under spring tension and returned to its original rearward position. Irwin pushed it again with the same result. It doesn't feel like anything is broken. Why won't it stay in the new setting? He held the gun up close to his face, looking in all the gaps and spaces between parts as he pressed the button on the left side forward once more. Irwin saw minute movement of 2 of the internal parts. They were both on the centerline axis of the gun's cylinder. He held the button forward and gripped the gun firmly with his free hand, being careful not to touch the trigger. The cylinder, which had been locked rigidly in place, moved slightly. He pushed on it, first to the right, then the left. It swung out of the gun's frame on a pivoting metal arm. All 6 cartridges were plainly visible. It's not the safety, he thought triumphantly. It's a latch to open the gun and load or unload it. The young man held the gun with the muzzle pointed towards the ceiling of the ruined building and shook it gently. 3 of the 6 cartridges dropped out of the cylinder into his left hand. The other 3 stayed where they were. Irwin started to look for a stick or a nail to push the remaining ones out from the front. That can't be right, he thought. There must be another way. A slender rod extended from the center of the cylinder. Irwin grabbed it and tried to pull it out, thinking that it was there for the shooter to poke the cartridges out one at a time. It would not move. On an impulse, he pushed on the rod. It immediately slid into the front of the cylinder. At the cylinder's back, a flower-shaped piece of metal underneath the rims of the cartridges extended rearward an equal amount, extracting the remaining rounds of ammunition all at the same time. The cartridges fell to the floor, and when Irwin let go of the rod, it snapped back under spring tension, and the 6-pointed piece of metal attached to its back end was once again seated in the rear of the cylinder. Mann smiled. He looked the empty gun over carefully. He held it up to the light and peered down the bore. Irwin saw 5 spiral grooves evenly spaced, twisting down the barrel's interior. In a sudden flash of inspiration, he realized they were there to make the bullet spin and fly straight, like a football thrown by an American he had seen on a newsreel 10 years before. As the gun gave up its secrets and revealed the unerring logic of its design, Irwin Mann felt his anxiety replaced with exhilaration, hope, and an overwhelming sense of purpose. In the next hour, by practicing with the empty weapon, Irwin learned that there were 2 ways to make the gun fire. First, as he had seen earlier, if he pulled the hammer back until it caught, the cylinder turned into position, and the trigger only took a slight pull to make the hammer fall and fire the gun. If he pulled the trigger without first cocking the hammer, it took a lot more effort, and it made the cylinder rotate and the hammer retract before falling on the new chamber at the end of the stroke. There is no safety on a revolver, he realized. The effort and distance required to pull the trigger when the hammer is not cocked makes it impossible for it to happen by accident. He was also aware of another truth. If the ammunition is bad and doesn't go off, I can try the next cartridge just by pulling the trigger again. That's why I have heard that revolvers are easier to use and more reliable. Irwin Mann's confidence continued to increase. For the next hour, the young Jew practiced pulling the empty gun out of the pocket of his overcoat, pointing it at an imagined enemy and pulling the trigger. He realized that an alert adversary might react to a sudden movement, and he tried holding his left arm bent and in front of his body to ward off defensive maneuvers, keeping his gun hand at his side where it touched his waist just above the hip bone. Got to find a soldier in the area who is alone, Irwin thought. The patrols invariably travel at least in pairs and usually in groups of 3. Irwin Mann had no illusions that he would be able to prevail against anything more than a single unsuspecting enemy. But a soldier will go out alone when he's doing something he doesn't want seen by his companions, Irwin reminded himself. This was not unusual. Extortion was common. So was bartering military-issue foodstuffs and medicine for the gold and gems that some of the Jews had brought into Warsaw with them. Rape was also a fact of life. The German soldiers would almost never touch the Jewish women in the area. They were seen as subhuman. Lithuanians and Poles had no such qualms. Maybe I can find one on a solo outing with rape in mind, Irwin told himself. His thoughts went to the last time he had seen his wife. We'll take great pleasure in changing the man's plans. Most of the soldiers patrolling the ghetto were in fact not Germans. It was considered light duty, and much of the work was performed by Lithuanian militiamen and Polish police who were viewed with scorn by Nazi soldiers. The benefit of this fact was that if a Lithuanian or Pole went missing, he would be assumed to have skipped out. No one will think he has been the victim of an ambush, Irwin reassured himself. Not the first one, at least. There is also the matter of noise, Irwin reminded himself. Even when I find a lone soldier, I must be sure that others do not rush in too soon at the sound of a shot. Risky though it might be, he decided that his best chance would be to shove the barrel of the gun into the fabric of the thick uniform coat that the soldiers wore, before pulling the trigger. It would mean rushing up to the intended victim instead of shooting him from a position of concealment, but Irwin decided it still offered the best probability of success. Will also be a lot less likely that I'll miss. He carefully reloaded the revolver and put it back in the right pocket of his coat. From the left pocket he withdrew the other weapon that he intended to use. It was a well-worn but serviceable pair of small Zeiss-folding binoculars. He had managed to acquire them several weeks before from a young woman who had also been relocated to the Warsaw Ghetto. Erwin Mann had not been sure how he would use them, but he had never doubted that they would become a great asset. Using the glasses, Erwin looked out the broken window and up and down the street. He saw only other Jews trudging beside the buildings. Only one thing to do, then he decided. It's time to go hunting. Mann went back out the doorway and walked into the street. His head was bowed as he took on the defeated, hopeless air of the other residents of the city, but his spirits were soaring. For the first time in months, he felt truly alive. It did not take long. In a few blocks, he came upon a German soldier who had just finished using the butt of his rifle on a man who appeared to be about 65 years old, but who was actually 51.
Filthy cur! You will not again waste my time when you have nothing to trade. Or perhaps you will be on Friday's train, and there will not be a next time, eh?
The soldier lad just finished reslinging his rifle over his shoulder when Erwin Mann acted. The young Jew thrust the barrel of the revolver against the soldier's spine between his shoulder blades, pushing it into the man with both his hands. He was driving forward just as he would if he had no gun and were trying to shove the soldier across the street. As he felt the man's body start to give under the unexpected force, Erwin pulled the trigger. He had expected the technique to somewhat muffle the report of the gun, and he was not disappointed. As with any revolver, some high-pressure gases escaped between the thin gap between the cylinder and barrel, so the sound of the shot was still there, but all the burning powder that normally would have blasted out the muzzle was trapped. That caused a result that Erwin Mann had not expected. With the muzzle of the gun pressed firmly against the Nazi's back, not only had the bullet entered his flesh, but the entire explosive force of the burning powder and high-pressure gases behind the bullet in the barrel of the gun had been directed into the man's body as well. The net effect was the same as if a small explosive charge had been detonated inside the soldier's body. One vertebra, the ends of two ribs, part of one lung, and the edge of the man's heart were re-destroyed in a millisecond. A slurry of these ruined parts sloshed down onto the dead man's diaphragm, leaving a cavity the size of a cantaloupe where the organs had been just a moment before. As this happened, the barrel of the gun slid into the entrance hole in the soldier's back, and the jagged bottom of the upper section of his ruined spine snagged the gun's front sight. Erwin Mann, who was holding the revolver with an adrenaline-charged grip, was pulled down on top of the falling body. The force of his own weight landing on the dead Nazi drove the air out of the remaining lung and made a retching sound that startled the young man. In the instant before his mind realized what had happened, he thought the man might still be alive. Erwin immediately leaped to his feet. Withdrawing the gun from the soldier's back, he was vaguely aware of the gore which dripped from it as he thrust it into his coat pocket and grabbed the corpse by the ankles. Erwin turned his head so that if the old man that his soldier had clubbed was looking, he would not see Erwin's face. His heart was racing, and with the strength that fear and excitement can bring, he quickly dragged the body into the alley. The Jew had half expected to feel nausea after the killing, but the fear of discovery and the fact that his job was far from over combined to fully occupy his senses. He would not feel the magnitude of what he had just done until much later. Erwin's first surprise was that it was harder to remove an overcoat from a dead body than he had ever imagined. After the coat was off, the former grocer wrapped the rifle in it so that it would be a little less conspicuous. He also took the spare ammunition for the rifle, the 9mm Luger autoloading pistol from the man's belt holster, the spare-loaded pistol magazines, and a handful of paper currency. He pulled off the man's boots and socks and cut off his shirt and pants with a pair of tailor's shears he had carried in his pocket. He then covered the body with debris from the alley. Erwin hoped that to a casual glance from another soldier, it would look like just another Jew who had died of starvation or exposure. The discovery of a slain German soldier would be big news indeed, and elicit a response he could not afford. Using a different route, Erwin returned to a building he knew was unoccupied. He knew it was vacant because one of the weaker inhabitants of the Warsaw Ghetto had died in the basement 6 days earlier, and the corpse was still there. The stench was terrible, but it discouraged others from using either the basement or the ground floor. Erwin stayed long enough to study the rifle to make sure he understood how it worked. The rifle was a Mauser 8mm Model 98, a bolt-action weapon whose method of function was immediately obvious even to someone with no previous experience. Lifting the round end of the bolt handle rotated the bolt and unlocked it so that it could be drawn to the rear. Pushing the bolt forward from that position placed a cartridge in the chamber, and pushing the handle back down again locked the breech and rendered the gun ready to fire. Irwin drew back the rifle's bolt and saw a full load of ammunition in the magazine. The top round slipped under the extractor as the bolt reached its rearward limit. He pushed the bolt forward and the top cartridge slid into the chamber. Irwin retracted the bolt once more and the cartridge was thrown out onto the floor. The young man practiced the maneuver until all the cartridges lay at his feet. He was satisfied that he understood the weapon's basic functioning. It did not register on Irwin Mann that the rifle had had no round in the chamber when the soldier had been carrying it. Irwin wrapped the rifle, the Luger, and the ammunition in the soldier's coat and stowed them under the stairs. He left the overpowering smell of the basement and went outside. It was time to look for more prey. In the next 3 hours, using much the same technique, Irwin Mann killed 2 more armed enemies. The first was a sallow-looking Lithuanian. The other was a conscript of indeterminate origin. The young grocer's efforts netted him 2 more 8mm Mauser rifles, a 7.6 2mm Polish Nagant revolver, a Walther P38 9mm pistol, 72 cartridges, 3 packs of cigarettes, a gravity knife, more Deutschmarks, and some Polish zlotys. Both soldiers had been carrying their rifles with empty chambers. The handguns had loaded chambers and had been ready to fire, but they had been carried in flap holsters with thongs tying the flap shut. It would have taken the soldiers less time to load their rifles than to get their pistols free from their holsters. Irwin Mann was too excited to notice this fact. The fourth soldier Irwin chose was a Lithuanian carrying an MP-28 submachine gun. He had spotted him just before dusk by using the binoculars and decided that he had to get the gun. His people would need such a weapon for when they were attacked by a group of Nazis coming to take them away. Irwin knew it would not be a matter of if, but when. Bunches of Jews were being herded out of the overcrowded ghetto and into railroad cars every day. None, of course, had ever returned, but the crude comments of the stormtroopers could not be discounted. The Jews were being sent to mass executions. Irwin used the same technique that had worked successfully thrice before. The soldier had just started to turn when the muzzle of the revolver, backed by 70 kilos of charging 25-year-old, hit him just below the right shoulder blade and knocked him off balance as Irwin Mann pulled the trigger. Click. Whether the round of ammunition had gone bad or whether the gun's mainspring was just a little too weak to always fire the cartridges reliably, Irwin Mann would never know. What he did realize in the instant that he landed on top of the startled soldier was that he was going to have to use his bare hands to kill a man with a machine gun. The soldier was young and in good physical condition, and his reflexes were quick. He had been taken completely by surprise, however, and this was the first time he had actually fought for his life at close quarters. As he landed on his left side with the young Jew tumbling on top of him, he made the common error of trying to get his weapon into play rather than react with a quicker though less lethal response. Irwin Mann instinctively pounded at the soldier's face with his right fist, which was still holding the revolver. The barrel punched into Private Muller's right eye socket just as Irwin Mann did another instinctive thing and pulled the trigger. The gun did not misfire this time. The explosion of the cartridge was again contained, but this time within a much smaller and less elastic space than the chest cavity of a grown man. This time the pressure was released inside a small chamber made of thick bone. Fluid dynamics dictated that the soldier's brain matter be driven out of his skull through the paths of least resistance, and it was. Severed the left optic nerve, and Private Muller's left eyeball was blown out of his head. It came to rest almost 10 meters down the street, where it was soon eaten by one of the many scavenging creatures that fed on corpses before work details hauled them away. Brain matter followed the eyeball, and a small amount also came out the dead man's ears and nostrils. The balance of the gray tissue followed the bullet out the hole it made in the occipital region at the back of the soldier's head. The soft lead bullet was stopped by Private Miller's helmet, and it left a visible dent which gave the steel headpiece the incongruous appearance of a large green woman's breast. The helmet also prevented the bullet from shattering Irwin Mann's left hand, which it would have done if the young private had been bareheaded. Irwin Mann scrambled to his feet. This time the sight of the dead man had a definite effect on him. The soldier's face had been barely a foot from his own, and seeing the man's brains spilling out of the eye socket and clinging to the back of Irwin's hand had suddenly made the young grocer feel lightheaded and faint. Mann realized he could not afford to indulge in revulsion. He wiped his right hand, which still clutched the revolver, on the soldier's tunic. For a final time that day, he dragged the dead weight out of sight where it would not immediately be discovered. The sling of the MP-28 submachine gun slid off the dead man's shoulder, and Irwin ran quickly back to the middle of the street to retrieve the weapon. This time he did not strip the corpse. Irwin removed his own coat and slung the short weapon over his neck after removing its magazine. When he put the coat back on and fastened the 2 buttons it still retained, the gun was not visible. The man had carried no sidearm or other weapon, and Irwin soon learned why. To his great pleasure, he discovered that the soldier had been carrying 6 spare loaded magazines for his MP-28, in addition to the one that had been in the gun. Irwin would not know exactly that he had another 175 rounds of ammunition until he unloaded the magazines and counted the cartridges, but he knew it was a lot. Fine work for my first day on the new job. He put the 7 magazines into the left side pocket of his coat. They were too long and protruded several inches out the top. Irwin cut a section from the dead soldier's shirt and tied it around the exposed ends of the magazines. Dusk had come, and the makeshift cover would be adequate for the journey back to where he had hidden the other weapons. Irwin Mann walked briskly out of the alley and down the street. His discomfort at the sight of the man's ruined face was completely forgotten. April 18th, 1943. The people in the crowded room stared silently at Irwin Mann. Their expressions showed admiration, respect, and horror. Lying on the blanket in front of them were the weapons, ammunition, money, and other assets he had acquired the day before. It was Stern who finally spoke. "You have done what others would not, young man. I am proud of you. Proud and thankful. He is murdered in cold blood. He is no better than the Nazis themselves. Look at him. He has their blood on his hands and clothing even as he stands here before us," said a man of about 40 at the side of the room. Stern fixed the speaker with a penetrating stare. "You have forgotten your Talmud, sir. He who comes to kill you, arise and kill him. Sanhedrin 72a, Barakos 58a and 62 billions, Makos 85 billions, and Midrash Tanchuma, Pinchas 3. His gaze softened slightly. Leviticus 19:16 is worth remembering as well. "Thou shalt not stand idly by the blood of your brother." I am afraid we have all stood idly by for far too long. He turned to Irwin Mann. "Perhaps it would be best if you were to advise us on the proper use of these tools." Stern nodded to Irwin, transferring his authority to the younger man. "We have 3 rifles, 3 pistols, and a small machine gun," he started. "The 3 rifles all use the same ammunition, and we have 31 of those cartridges. 2 of the pistols and the machine gun all use another kind of ammunition, and we have 221 of that type. The revolver here," he said, pointing to the nagant, "uses a 3rd type of ammunition. We have 12 shots for it." The group looked on silently, waiting for him to continue. "Our armament is minuscule compared to that of the Nazis. For this reason, we must not waste a single one of these bullets. If we make each one count, we can continue to replenish our stocks." He saw nods of agreement among several of the assembled men, and he went on. "This is the way the rifles work," he said, picking up a Mauser and manipulating the bolt. "They hold 5 cartridges in here." He pointed to the magazine well. "This lever prevents the gun from firing." Mann flipped on the safety and made a show of pulling the trigger. Nothing happened. He flicked the safety to its previous position and pulled the trigger again. The striker made a loud click as it fell. "How do you aim it precisely?" a man asked him. "If you want to shoot something that is not so close to you?" Everyone knew what something was going to be. Irwin took a deep breath. He was rapidly approaching the limit of his knowledge of firearms. "You line up the notch in this piece of steel here," he said, pointing to the blade of the rear sight, "with this thin piece here," pointing to the front sight, "and then put the 2 of them both in line with the Nazi you intend to shoot." "Let me try it." Irwin handed him the empty rifle. The man put it up to his shoulder and squinted. Hard to hold it steady. He stepped over to the wall and pushed his left hand, which held the stock's forend, against the doorframe. That's a lot better. Is the front sight supposed to stick up over the notch in the piece at the back? Is it supposed to cover up the spot where you want the bullet to hit? Irwin started to say he wasn't sure when another man spoke up. Let me look at it, please. He took the rifle and examined the rear sight carefully, noting the numbered markings on it, how it moved up and down, and how it clicked into different settings when he manipulated it. Then he sighted along the barrel as the other man had done. The rear piece adjusts and is marked for different ranges. By moving this piece to a higher numbered position, he demonstrated by raising the rear sight to a new setting, the rifle will be aimed upwards to a slightly greater degree, and the bullet will strike a more distant target. Here, I will illustrate. He reached for a stone to scratch with in the dirt on the floor. You are familiar with weapons? Irwin asked in surprise. The man paused and shook his head. No, but I have a degree in mathematics, and I am well versed in the physics of moving objects. Though I have no experience with guns or bullets, I am absolutely certain they must obey every one of Newton's laws. He scratched a curve of decreasing radius on the floor, and lay a small stick in line with it, touching the start of the curve. This stick is the rifle. The bullet will describe a parabola through the air, like this scratch. Up close, the path will curve so slightly as to appear to be a straight line. He held his hands on each side of the first 6 inches of the curve. The section did indeed appear to be straight. At greater distances, the curvature will be much more apparent, and errors in aiming or in range estimation will be more pronounced. He moved his left hand farther away from the right, and the curvature of the scratch was obvious. The mathematician laid a straight piece of wood above the small stick, parallel with the start of the curve. The edge of this wood represents a straight path from the eyeball to the target. That is the shooter's line of sight. Suppose we raise the rear sight, like so. He lifted the back of the piece of wood, and then picked up the rifle and held it level. His finger touched the weapon's rear sight, and he made a motion for the group to imagine that it stood up much higher. He angled the gun so that the imagined new rear sight and the sight on the muzzle were once again level with the floor. If we line the sights up with the spot we wish to hit, you see that the barrel of the gun is angled upward slightly. The path of the bullet will rise at first as the bullet approaches the target because the gun is angled upwards. As gravity continues to exert its relentless pull, the bullet will curve back towards the ground. He ran his finger along the curve to illustrate his point. If the shooter has estimated the distance to the target correctly and placed the rear sight in the appropriate setting, the path of the bullet will intersect the line of sight at the target. He paused to make sure everyone was with him. There were only a few puzzled looks, so he went on with his explanation. You see that if the rear sight is raised higher than it should be, he said as he tipped the rifle's muzzle up farther, you will shoot over the target if the rear sight is set too low. Here he held his finger against the barrel to indicate a lowered rear sight, and leveled the gun once more, and the target is far away, the bullet will strike too low because gravity is pulling it down as it flies towards the target. The mathematician looked at the group and saw nods of understanding and a few tentative smiles. As to exactly how the two sights should be aligned, I am not certain, but I suspect the gun should be positioned so the top of the front sight is level with the sides of the rear sight. A short, balding man cleared his throat and spoke for the first time. I do not know for certain either, as I know nothing of guns, but I am an optometrist. I can say with conviction that the eye and the brain are very good at detecting whether or not two identical shapes standing side by side are level or if one is slightly above the other. The eye and brain are not so good at recognizing whether or not a difference in alignment is exactly the same as a previous misalignment. It would be easiest for the person using the weapon to duplicate his results if he aligned the sights in the manner you have described. Further nods followed this explanation. Irwin Mann felt a surge of hope. The men in the group were applying themselves to the problems at hand and working together. Confidence and sense of purpose were building. How critical is distance estimation? Asked another member of the group, directing his question to the mathematician. The scholar nodded. A good question. It becomes more critical with either increased distance or smaller target size, or both. He examined the rifle's rear sight again. From these markings, it appears that at any distance under 100 meters, the path of the bullet will be near enough to straight that no adjustment is needed. He held the rifle up, bracing it against the doorframe and aligning the front and rear sights with the distant point visible through the broken window. He raised the rear sight to the 200-meter setting while continuing to stare at the distant mark. Even at 200 meters, the change is slight, less than 10 centimeters difference. He was thinking quickly as he analyzed the unfamiliar weapon using the comforting logic of mathematics. That should not be critical on a target the size of a man's chest. The most important requirement will be careful alignment of the sights, holding the rifle steady, and squeezing the trigger carefully so as not to move the gun before it fires. Whoever uses these rifles should also have excellent vision. He smiled ruefully. A steady hand, good muscle control, and calm actions may be difficult to achieve when the natural tendency is to panic. Who among us is a surgeon? The question startled the group with its seeming incongruity, then everyone saw the logic of it. It was no accident that Stern was a leader. I am, two men said very nearly in unison. They were both gaunt like almost everyone else in the group. One appeared to be in his late 50s, the other was almost completely bald and therefore looked older. Stern looked at both the men. If both of you are capable of delicate surgery in the face of complications, I suspect your eyes and coordination are good, you have steady hands, and are not likely to panic. He paused a moment and continued, Your knowledge of anatomy would also be a definite asset. He added without elaborating further, Shooting carefully at a distance should not require the energy and stamina of a young man. Will the two of you accept this task for us? The two doctors looked at each other and nodded. You brought us these weapons, Stern said to Irwin Mann. Do you concur with my suggestion? Mann nodded his immediate agreement. We must make the best possible use of the individual talents we possess. There is a third rifle, Irwin pointed out. This man, he said, indicating the mathematician, does not strike me as someone prone to panic, and his inherent understanding of the flight paths of bullets is probably far superior to that of anyone else here. I think he should be our third marksman. The mathematician was startled by the term used to describe him, and felt a surge of pride as he saw the entire assembly nod agreement to Irwin's suggestion. Is anyone here especially good at estimating distances? Each of these three men will need someone to help determine how far away the targets are. It was a new participant speaking. Everyone in the group looked around, but no one had a vocation which required an ability to accurately judge unknown distances. Perhaps I have an answer. A man of about 40 was now speaking. My training is as an architect. Distances can be determined mathematically by the simple method of proportionality if the size of an object at the unknown distance is known. Since most soldiers are about 1.8 meters tall, I think that with this gentleman's help, he said, indicating the mathematician, we should be able to construct a simple rangefinder out of a ruler and perhaps a piece of string or thread to hold the ruler a known distance from the eye. An obvious answer, said the mathematician with mild embarrassment. I don't know where my mind is. He did not say that he had been preoccupied with how Irwin Mann had referred to him as a marksman. Are all of you insane? What you are describing is utter suicide. We have no chance at all against the forces that will surely be massed against us if we persist in this madness. The speaker was the man who had earlier accused Irwin of being no different from the Nazis and had been rebuked by Stern. A few voices murmured agreement. Anyone who stopped to think about what they were planning could not avoid being overwhelmed by the enormity of the task they faced. Perhaps I can convince you otherwise. All heads turned towards the newest speaker. I am not a Jew. I am from Warsaw originally. My wife is a Jew, and I am a teacher of history who has some knowledge of warfare and battles. He paused, framing his explanation in his mind before speaking. In every war, but particularly those wars that have been fought in the last 150 years, there have been many examples of superior attacking forces being repelled by defenders with woefully smaller manpower and weaponry. Many scholars wrongly assume that this is the result of embellishment, because of our natural tendency to wish that the weak prevail through sheer bravery, just as David smote Goliath. He shook his head slowly. That is not at all the correct explanation. His audience waited for him to continue. The nature of warfare changed forever with the development of weapons which could be carried by a single soldier and yet were capable of dealing a lethal blow at a distance. He paused to let those words sink in. With the advent of such weapons, the determining factor in any single ground conflict was altered for all time. The man's nervousness vanished as he fell into the familiar role of teacher lecturing his class. It had been 2 years since he had been a free man, but the rhythm and method came back immediately. With swords and shields, all conflicts were out in the open, and the combatants had to be close enough to touch each other for any fighting to happen at all. Sheer numbers were by far the most important factor in determining the outcome of a battle. When the bow and arrow came into use, this was changed somewhat, but arrows fly slowly enough to be visible, and are effective only at short distances. A shield easily stops them, and the bow is unwieldy when the enemy is close at hand and charging with his sword and shield. Erwin Mann could see where the scholar was leading, and the hairs on his back stood up. The speaker continued his explanation. The crossbow was powerful enough to penetrate shields and armor, and could be used at greater distances. A man who concealed himself behind obstacles could make life very unpleasant for 6 strong men who were trying to kill him, if that man had a crossbow and could use it well. The advantage shifted much further in favor of the defending side as more accurate and compact weapons were invented that were usable at greater distances. We are all familiar with how an American band of farmers defeated the finest army in the world during their War of Independence. I am perhaps more familiar than the rest of you with the events of that war, not only because of my former profession, but also because Casimir Pulaski and Tadeusz Kościuszko, 2 Poles who fought with the Americans, are national heroes here. Perhaps a history lesson about that war will be helpful to our own plans. He saw that he had their attention and launched into his lecture. The old habits of teaching a group came back instantly. In 1775, with the exception of Switzerland, every single country on earth, if it was ruled at all, was ruled by kings, kings that had the divine authority to do anything that they pleased by virtue of their birth. He paused to let that sink in before adding, men who often behaved much like Adolf Hitler. France was ruled by King Louis XVI. What we now call Germany was ruled by King Frederick II of Prussia. Russia was ruled by the Tsar Peter Il's widow Catherine the Great. China was ruled by Emperor Qianlong. Japan was ruled by Emperor Tokugawa. All of Latin America was ruled by King Charles II of Spain, except for Brazil, which was ruled by King Joseph of Portugal. Scandinavia was under the power of the King Gustav III of Sweden. Africa was a vast continent of waning tribes, each with its own tribal king. That continent had small coastal pockets of organized civilization. Every one of those was ruled by the king of the European country that had colonized it, like King George who ruled England and all its colonies. He stopped to take a breath and saw that the group's attention was total. That included the colonies in America. Lecturing transformed the Pole into a different man. There was unmistakable steel in his voice as he continued the history lesson, and the men in the group were transfixed by his words. He was a powerful instructor. In 1775, King George sent his armies to America to make the colonists give up their weapons. At Lexington, British Major Pitcairn said, "Drop your weapons and disperse, rebels." The colonists said no and fired on the British soldiers. There was no sound in the crowded room except for soft breathing. We must never forget just who these people were. The British soldiers' uniforms of the day were bright red, and it is far too easy to think of them as amusing costumed characters in a children's play. Perhaps you have recently noticed some ornate uniforms which by themselves might be seen as amusing. This brought nods of understanding from his audience. The British Army was one of the largest, strongest, best trained, and best equipped armies in the entire world. In 1775, they were the SS. They were the Gestapo. A bunch of farmers said no to that army. They said they would not be ruled by a king. They said they were going to determine their own destiny. Those farmers fought that world-class army, and they drove it all the way back into Boston. The men in that world-class army who were still alive hid in Boston and were afraid to come out because those fanners would kill them as soon as they did. He paused again and tried to make eye contact with every man in the room, and that is why a famous American poet called it the shot heard round the world. It took a long time for the sound of that shot to reach France and Germany and Italy and Asia, but reach them it did. Do you think there would have been a French Revolution if the Americans had not shown that it could be done? Most of the men in the room shook their heads involuntarily. In some countries, the people have not yet been able to wrest control of their destiny from tyrants. That is why America has become the adopted home of many of the world's oppressed people. Bravery and heroism are absolutely necessary. Make no mistake about that. We will certainly fail if we are unwilling to take the risks required. But those American farmers had an advantage in addition to their bravery. They had weapons which could be used from positions of concealment and were skilled at using them. That is how they protected themselves from the attacking forces. It is how we will do it as well. But the Nazis have many more of these same weapons and are much more skilled at using them, blurted out one of the group. The former history teacher smiled and addressed his pupil. That does not matter to nearly the degree that you believe, my friend. As defenders, we possess a great advantage. In order for the Nazis to do us harm, they must come search us out, look for us, smash in doors and break windows, never knowing what they will find. They cannot do these things without regularly exposing themselves. From our positions of concealment, we can kill them, take their weapons, and return to different hiding places. The men in the group looked at one another, further sobered by the speaker's words. In modern ground warfare, when an attacking force intends to overpower an entrenched adversary, the attacking force must be vastly superior in number, and must be willing to pay a very high price of heavy losses of its own soldiers. I am not at all convinced that the soldiers assigned to guard Warsaw will be eager to pay such a price. The stormtroopers had no trouble before when they broke our windows and smashed our doors to send us here like sheep for slaughter, a voice said from the back of the room. An older man standing next to Erwin spoke up in reply. The Nazis were not stupid. In fact, they were very logical. They knew that in order to accomplish what they intended, we had to pose no threat. We had to be stripped of the ability to defend ourselves. Do you not remember the law passed 5 years ago prohibiting us from having guns without government permission? The history teacher nodded. The Americans wrote that very issue into their list of fundamental citizens' rights, a part of their constitution, so that such tragedy could never again occur in their country. He paused, a sudden realization coming to him. Does it not seem odd to you that the Nazi leader has avoided any effort to send his troops to invade tiny, rich Switzerland? That instead he should concentrate on a larger country far more distant and requiring a crossing of the English Channel? Another man spoke up quickly. I have been to Switzerland several times and England twice. Each Swiss home I have seen contains a machine gun. At this statement the group erupted with protests of disbelief. No, it is true, said another over the hushed arguing. I have seen it myself. When I was in England, said a man who was speaking for the first time, a few of the wealthy had shotguns for shooting game birds. Murmurs of disapproval coursed through the assembled men. Killing animals for sport was contrary to Jewish law. I saw no weapon such as we have here that would be most suitable for repelling invaders. The English expect the Americans to rescue them, said a new voice. The history teacher replied to this. Is that not ironic, given that it was the English who attempted to disarm the colonists a century and a half ago? Puzzled looks greeted his question. The teacher looked startled. Have you never heard of one of their favorite stories, of Paul Revere? A few heads nodded. Paul Revere is an American hero because he warned the colonists that the British were on their way to seize their weapons, and the colonists said no. If the colonists had said yes and stacked their arms for confiscation as we did 5 years ago, the colonists would have been executed, and every country ruled by a king in 1775 would probably still be ruled by a king today. You cannot be serious! We are, 30 in number? Once again it was the man who had pointed out the blood on Erwin's clothing. Now Erwin spoke up. I was only one, and I am still healthy. You, sir, I do not trust. I do not trust you to help us, and I do not trust you to resist betraying us. He reached into his coat pocket, withdrew the revolver with which he had killed the 4 soldiers, and handed it to one of the men he knew well. Take him to another building where he cannot hear the rest of what we have to say. Give us half an hour, then give him the gun and let him go. Erwin turned to face the protester. There is 1 cartridge left in the gun. If you return with a German military weapon, it shall be yours, and I shall apologize in full for my lack of trust in you. Now go. Several in the group began to protest, but Stern raised his hand. He is asking only what he himself volunteered to do for all of us. The others fell silent, and Erwin's friend pushed the protester out of the room. No one there ever saw him again. After the pair had left, Erwin held his hand out to the Polish history teacher. My name is Erwin Mann. The teacher nodded. Piotr Halleck. Piotr Halleck, you have given us all much wisdom and hope. Somehow I feel that there is another shoe you have not let drop. Halleck nodded at Irwin's intuition. With the weapons we possess, we can effectively counter Nazi attempts to search us out. But there are methods they can use which are equally effective at dealing with entrenched adversaries. Yes? Irwin said, waiting for Halleck to continue. Methods which are much older than the weapons in this room, ones that the Nazis have already been using against our people. He took a deep breath. Starvation, for one. That will be a very real threat, more than it has been so far. Poison gas, for another. The Nazis are experts at confining large groups of us to small spaces and killing us in that way, but neither starvation nor poison gas should worry our group of resistance fighters as much as another method of destruction. He waited to see if any of his pupils would realize what that weapon was. Suddenly, Irwin Mann's eyes widened. Fire, he breathed softly. Several men in the room gasped. Halleck nodded at his student and smiled without pleasure. Exactly so. We are confined to a prison here in this section of Warsaw. Fire is our biggest enemy. Is there nothing we can do? Asked Irwin. The Pole's smile became more genuine. There is always a counter-strategy. Irwin Mann took a deep breath. Then, Piotr, let's talk about fire. The strategy session began in earnest. May 14th, 1943. Give me your hand. The boy refused. Give me your hand and climb down. They'll kill you if you stay up here. Sporadic gunfire crackled in the distance. The boy looked at the open sewer cover and shook his head violently. They are flooding the sewers and filling them with gas, which they then ignite. We'll be burned alive. What the boy said was true. In 1940, the German conquerors of Poland had confined almost 500,000 Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. By April of 1943, barely a tenth that number remained. Over 300,000 of them had been sent to death camps, and the rest had died of starvation and disease. The remaining 60,000 prisoners had realized they were doomed and had fought back, despite the fact that they had only a handful of weapons. Since April 19th, the Warsaw Ghetto had been under attack by over 2,000 heavily armed German troops, in addition to many more Lithuanian militiamen, Polish police, and Polish firefighters. After almost 4 weeks, only a few of the inhabitants remained alive. The Germans had systematically set the ghetto on fire block by block, just as Piotr Halleck had predicted. As Irwin and his few remaining compatriots had watched each potential refuge become an inferno, they realized that escape was their only hope, and that the sewers offered the only chance of that. The Germans had seen this as well and were pumping the underground tunnels full of water and flammable poison gas. Irwin Mann was running out of patience with the boy. If you won't come with me, then take this, he said finally, thrusting the Luger into the boy's hand. You have 8 shots. Use them carefully. This is the safety, he said, pointing. Push it down before you want to fight. The boy ran off while he was still explaining, and Irwin watched with dismay as he saw him cast the weapon aside, letting it clatter on the stones. Irwin Mann retrieved the pistol and thrust it into his pocket. He'll walk right into their arms, he thought with disgust. He climbed into the sewer and pulled the cover back into place. Blackness enveloped him. He had a few precious matches, but he did not intend to use them until he absolutely had to, and was sure he was not in the presence of flammable gas. Feeling around blindly, Irwin climbed down the iron steps set into the concrete and reached the bottom of the sewer. He heard the sound of a rat scurrying away from him, and he felt waves of both nausea and relief. Rats made his skin crawl. For months he had seen them feeding on the corpses of those who had succumbed to the starvation conditions of the Warsaw Ghetto. The noises they made in the darkness here, however, gave him hope. The passageway was probably not choked with sewage, and that had been his far greatest fear. The floor of the sewer was relatively clear, even dry in spots. We have had so little to dispose of, he thought with black humor as he felt his way on hands and knees down the pipe. The utter darkness gave a surrealistic feeling to the entire process, and Irwin found that if he closed his eyes it was less disorienting than if he left them open. Breathing the dank air was unpleasant, but not as foul as he had expected. His spirits lifted slightly. Maybe I really am going to make it. As he slowly moved along in the blackness, his hands and knees protected with rags he had tied around them, Irwin asked himself once again if he had done the right thing. They had always known they could not prevail, not ultimately, unless the Americans rescued them. After 3 weeks, The Warsaw inhabitants knew that was not going to happen in time. Their tiny armed resistance had surprised and astonished the Nazis at first, but the Germans came with more and more soldiers every day. The Jews had had less than 20 guns in all, and not a single skilled marksman among them. That surgeon did all right, though Irwin remembered with satisfaction, killed at least 20 before the heavy machine gun fire demolished his final hiding place. Irwin himself had used his earlier technique of killing at close range in the first few days of the resistance. After that, the troops had come in much greater numbers and never alone, so he had shot them at longer range from positions of concealment. The young fighter was bone-tired, but he continued to make his way down the dank passage in total. Darkness. After a period of time that Irwin couldn't judge, he came to a larger space. There was a bit of light filtering in from a grating above, and he realized he was at a junction of several sewer tunnels. He lay still on his stomach and held his breath, listening. Irwin believed that he wanted to angle off towards his right, but in his exhausted state, he had a sudden fear that he had become disoriented. He tried to ignore the beating of his heart and listen for noises. The distant sounds of battle came through the grating above, but down in the sewer it was impossible to judge the direction from which they came. A pair of rats scurried out of a tunnel to Irwin's left and ran across the larger space into a tunnel on the right. That settles it, Irwin thought with relief. Rats don't run towards trouble. Irwin man heaved himself to his hands and knees and followed after the vermin. The tunnel Irwin was in sloped upwards, and that was why the rodents had chosen it. The rats had run when they had first heard the sound of water, and their primal instincts drove them towards higher territory. It was the creatures' innate ability to survive that saved Irwin man's life along with their own. The water that the Germans were pumping in flowed to the lowest part of the sewer lines. As it did, it formed a barrier between the higher end where Irwin was and the opposite end where the German soldiers were dropping their poison smoke candles. By the time the Germans had discovered that the sewers at the edge of the ghetto were still clear and took steps to change that, Irwin man had passed under the walled boundary and had escaped into the Polish section of Warsaw. "Keep pumping," the Nazi officer commanded when he saw water bubbling out of a sewer grate onto the street 60 meters away. "The sewers are almost full." He imagined the wretched Jews underneath his feet, unable to breathe. Suddenly he saw fingers push through the bars of the grating, and he stood near the opening, waiting to see if the man could raise the heavy cover. The soldier aimed his pistol at the sewer grate, ready to shoot if the man lifted it off. The drowning man slowly released his grip on the bars, and his fingers disappeared under the water. The German holstered his pistol and smiled with satisfaction. It was not as satisfying as watching them burn, but very good nonetheless. "Shut off the water! No air remains!" the Nazi yelled to his men. He was walking back to them when the bullet struck the edge of his spinal cord just below the base of his neck. The shot did not kill him, but he was now paralyzed from the neck down. For the rest of his life he would be fed, bathed, and clothed by others. Isaac Epstein, former math teacher, gave a sigh of contentment and lay down his rifle. He did not bother to work the Mauser's bolt, for the gun was now empty and he had no more cartridges. Neither did he attempt to leave his place of hiding. His right ankle was broken, and he had inhaled enough burning gas that he knew he did not have long to live, even if no soldiers came for him. Isaac Epstein lay back among the rubble and closed his eyes, waiting for the Germans to find him. "Marksman," he thought with pride. "That's what that young man called me." A smile of satisfaction came across his tired face. A few moments later his heart stopped beating. The smile remained. May 16, 1943. The Nazi general surveyed the smoking ruins of what had been the Warsaw Ghetto. A bitter smile curled the corner of his mouth. He took the proffered field telephone from his aide and spoke into it. "The former Jewish quarter of Warsaw is no longer in existence," he said succinctly. "I shall have a casualty total by tomorrow morning, and you can expect my full report within 48 hours. Heil Hitler!" He handed the instrument back to his aide and returned to his staff car. 2 kilometers to the east, Irwin man crouched in an alley. He had slept fitfully, always frightened of being discovered. His fears, while justified, were exaggerated. Huddled amongst refuse in the dim Warsaw morning, he was just another undernourished Pole with nowhere better to sleep. No one who saw him would have suspected he was a Jew who had escaped from the ghetto, for that was unheard of. Irwin assessed his situation. His clothes were in tatters and unspeakably dirty. They would have to be replaced. He himself was filthy, and he had not eaten for almost 3 days. On the positive side of the ledger, he still had a few zlotys in his pocket, as well as the Luger and a full magazine of cartridges. His body, though weak, was undamaged. Have come this far, he thought with grim determination. Will not be defeated now. He stood up and stretched, working some of the stiffness out of his aching muscles. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, and Irwin turned to look at the blackened sky in the distance. Some ideas were coming to him. I'm going to get through this, he decided, and began planning his next move. We have found no survivors, Herr General, and but a handful of weapons, said the young soldier as he clicked his heels together and saluted. The general acknowledged the soldier and nodded. These swine had no chance against us. It is appalling that they even resisted. He did not say what was actually on his mind. A ragged band of Jews with a few guns and no military training whatsoever had managed to hold off the best efforts of the German army. This fact went counter to everything the general had ever known about Jews. He briefly wondered how they had accomplished this feat and who had been leading them, then pushed the disturbing thoughts out of his mind and returned to more immediate tasks. The general's unease was well founded, and the Warsaw Ghetto resistance would be a valuable history lesson for anyone who studied it. With less than 20 weapons, a starving band of resistors had held off the German army for 27 days and nights before being defeated. When the German army had conquered the entire country of Poland in 1939, it had taken them 16 days. June 6, 1944. Max Collins fixed his eyes on the small distant square. He turned his head slightly to the right and spat into the dust in the corner. They'll be there soon. Collins saw a slight movement in the distance. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the small monocular he carried. After a long look and a quick breath, he put it away. They're here. Now he had his job to do. The glider descent had gone seriously awry. The pilot had tried to center the fuselage between the two trees to clip both wings off and slow the craft down, but he had been too far to one side. The glider had spun to the left and overturned. Collins had come to in the grass, wet with his own vomit and another's blood. Not until he had seen the tattered wings had he remembered where he was. He hadn't been able to determine how long he had been unconscious, but it was long enough that there seemed to be no reason for great haste. The wreckage had been extensive. The jeep had broken its moorings and caused most of the damage. Impact with the ground had done the rest. Max had found no other survivors. The green, padded canvas case had made it safely, though. He had found it cushioned between two still warm corpses and had gently retrieved it. It, too, was stained with blood. At least the landing went undetected, Sergeant Collins had thought as he had trudged off in the darkness towards the town with the case under his arm. He had immediately realized that the bell tower was the best choice. It surveyed most of the town, but was well away from the heart of the village. Max Collins had quickly found the proper entrance at the back of the church and settled himself in a corner of the elevated, open-sided structure. Then, as always, he had slept. There was nothing more sensible to do before sunrise. Dawn had broken, and now it was time. Max gently slid the rifle from its drop case and slowly surveyed it for damage. None was visible. The rifle was mute testimony to the Army's willingness to bend the rules to further its own interests. It was a Springfield, and it had been issued, but there ended its likeness to the standard weapon. Collins had spent hours of his time while the others played poker, removing the barreled action from the stock, coating it with a mix of lampblack and oil, replacing it, and removing it again. From the black marks on the bare wood, he had seen the high spots where metal rested on wood. Through tedious scraping and repetition of the entire process, he had achieved near complete contact of the action with the stock. The wood under the barrel was relieved to let the barrel vibrate when the gun was fired, in accordance to its natural frequency. The rifle, as Max was fond of saying, shot like it had eyes. His efforts, however, had not stopped there. The outside of the stock had been treated to 12 coats of marine spar varnish, ensuring that it would not warp when the humidity changed. A change of 1/1000th of an inch could move the bullet's point of impact half a foot at 100 yards, and it was not possible to sight the gun in anew every time the weather changed. The rifle's most flagrant departure from regulations was the 2.5-power Lyman Alaskan scope, anchored to a bridge Mount Max had persuaded a machinist to make for him. The magnification it offered was less important than the fact that sights and target were now in the same plane of vision, and therefore always both in focus. General Gavin himself had seen Max shooting this rig for group at 300 yards, as he did every few days when circumstances permitted. The general had taken time to examine the group, 5 shots in 4 1/8 inches about average for the gun, looked at the head stamp on the fired brass which said National Match, meaning it was authorized for use only by military marksmanship teams, and had said, "Carry on, Sergeant." After that, Max Collins had quit worrying about what officers might do if they saw his rifle. Max folded the blood-stained case and laid it on the ledge as a rest. He was risking being seen with the forend and barrel of his rifle exposed, but in the early dawn he'd take the gamble. Through the telescope he saw the 2 sentries. Collins was using a 3-dot reticle, and the smallest dot, the one lowest on the vertical crosshair, covered 2 minutes of angle, 2 inches at 100 yards. With that fact, you could use the reticle to calculate range if you knew the dimensions of the object you were looking at. He centered the dot on the German's face. The man's face was more than covered by the spot. He moved the rifle slightly, so that the dot reticle was next to the man's head. He decided that the dot was twice the width of the soldier's face. 1 minute of angle to cover his head. Max Collins let out a long breath. His pale eyes narrowed as he laid the rifle and case back on the floor of the tower. Before he had enlisted, Max had been an illustrator, and like any decent artist, he knew anatomy well enough to teach it. Cheekbone to cheekbone, the widest spot on the head, on an average man, was 5 3/4 inches. 575 yards. He didn't like it at all. Trying to get closer would be risking discovery as well as eliminating his already slim chances for escape. He picked up a small chunk of concrete and started to scratch in the dust. At 575 yards, the rifle would put 5 shots into an 8-inch circle under ideal conditions. About the size of a man's head, he thought. At 500 yards, point of impact is 31 inches low, and at 600 yards, 60 inches low. 55 inches low, then. The air is cool and misty, denser than usual, more resistance, more drop. His gut said 2% more air resistance. That translated to an additional 4% drop below line of sight. Another 2 inches. Hold 57 inches high, then. The problem of windage remained. Max looked down at the crude diagram he had scratched on the stones. It was an oval with a vertical line bisecting it. There was another line perpendicular to the vertical about 3 feet above the oval, and below this he had scratched 57 feet. He turned and spat more dust out of his mouth. He felt not even a whisper of wind on his cheek from where he sat in the high, open tower. 200 yards out, though, something's making that smoke from the chimney drift to the left and away. Over almost 600 yards, the wind could easily be blowing in more than one direction. He closed his eyes and sat motionless for a few moments. Too many variables. Max opened his eyes and looked for more smoke. He found another chimney in operation this early in the morning. It was in line with the target area, but quite a bit past it. As close as he could tell, its smoke was drifting in the same direction as the others. Well, that's something. He looked again at the smoke. A drift of about 10 miles per hour. No, a bit less than that. More than 5, though. Call it 7. But it was not a 7-mile-per-hour crosswind. He looked again, resisting the natural impulse to squint. Damn near 45 degrees. Another break. Crosswind component 71%, times 7 miles per hour, and we're back to a 5-mile-per-hour breeze drifting the bullet left. With the 172-grain military match boat tail, at 2,800 feet per second at the muzzle, 10 inches drift at 500 yards, 15 inches at 600. A private had once asked him what the trick was to figuring out the various drops and wind drifts in different winds, when a ballistics table was not at hand. Ever hear of those guys can take 2 3-digit numbers and give you the product straight off? Max had replied. Yes, sir, I believe I have, but I don't know how they do it either. Same simple trick I use, pure rote memorization. Like Ad Topperwine and John Browning, Max Collins was part of the gun culture. Max lifted the stone again, cushioning it against his calloused fingers. Along the horizontal scratch, about 10 inches to the right of the vertical mark, he made an X. Between this mark and the vertical line, he scratched the number 14. Now, as long as the conditions remained the same, there was just the waiting. He pulled the monocular out of his pocket once more and put it to his eye, watching the square. Max looked down at his drawing. Not much else to do now but wait and watch the conditions. Bingo, Max said silently when a figure appeared in the monocular. No ID training needed to pick this one out, he told himself. The way the German moved and the way the others reacted to him was all the proof Max needed. How many stars would he have if he'd been born a few thousand miles farther west? No matter. They can give him a hero's funeral. Max folded the canvas case in half and laid it on the ledge. He put the rifle on top of it, pointing towards the distant square. Through the scope he could see the man standing in perfect profile, giving orders. The American centered the crosshairs on the general's head and then released the rifle. It rocked on its canvas rest and pointed 10 yards left of where he wanted to hit. He cradled the rifle once more until it pointed where he wanted, this time pressing the weapon firmly into the rest before releasing it. The crosshairs shifted only a few feet, and in a vertical direction. When the rest was trying to hold the gun in a different spot than the shooter was, the gun would never shoot where it was supposed to. He put his shoulder to the flat steel butt plate and grasped the smooth grip with his right hand. The left thumb and forefinger pressed the sides of the buttstock, urging it to the exact spot. Collins placed the officer's throat equidistant between the man's heel and the center dot of the reticle. Then he moved the dot over 2 head widths. Too far. Ease it back some. 14 inches? Collins willed his head closer to the eyepiece, straining for that last bit of definition with which to measure the 14-inch space. He was glad that he never failed to fire a fouling shot with commercial non-corrosive ammo after cleaning his rifle. The first shot from a clean, dry bore never went into the same place as subsequent ones. Let's stick this one in his ear. Urged on by the gradually increasing pressure of his index finger, the sear released and the rifle bucked, taking him just a little by surprise. A good lead-off, he instantly realized, as the steel eyepiece at the back of the scope met his forehead and left a crescent-shaped gash on top of a half-dozen tiny white scars of the same shape. Crowded it too close again, he thought with the small part of his brain that wasn't filled with more important issues. As the blast rang off the ceiling of the bell tower, Max Collins flushed all the concerns of the last 3 hours from his mind and replaced them with an entirely new set. He had fired the only shot he was going to get. He had to get down and away immediately. And for one absurd, sickening moment, he had the irrational fear that he had found the wrong town, and the rest of the 82nd Airborne was miles away, about to storm the Real Stille. Mere église. He dismissed this nightmarish thought and scrambled down the ladder. The barometric pressure had been a bit higher than Max had estimated, and the range 30 yards farther. The bullet struck several inches lower than Collins' calculations had predicted. The general had been standing in profile at attention addressing his men, and the bullet struck him on the point of his shoulder. It deflected off the underlying bone and assumed a banana shape, as engineers a generation before had designed it to do. Yawing slightly, the slug ranged upwards, exited out the trapezius muscle, and immediately slammed sideways into the German's neck. The tumbling bullet severed the general's spine, leaving his head attached only by a few muscles in the left front of his neck before burying itself in a doorframe 30 meters beyond. The quick command stopped in mid-sentence with a noise that sounded like a leather bag bursting. Several enlisted men were sprayed with the dead officer's blood as he fell on his chest, struck down as if by a thunderbolt. His face bounced off the granite cobblestones with a sickening sound, breaking off both the front teeth. The force of the impact twisted the head around so that the corpse's face stared sightlessly to the side. 1.25 seconds later came the distant roar of the rifle. By the time the German soldiers realized what had happened, Max Collins was at ground level, exiting the church. By the time the shock major realized that he was now the senior officer and began issuing commands, Max was halfway to the relative safety of the woods. There, he knew he stood a chance of holding his own by silently removing his pursuers, one at a time. I can stay alive at least for a day or two, and by that time it will all be decided, one way or the other." As he continued his methodical, frantic escape, the sergeant's thoughts returned to that one fact which might comfort a gentler man in civilian life, but which stuck in his mind infuriatingly now. I may never know for sure. May 16th, 1945. At ease, Lieutenant. You're being sent home, and there are a few things I've been wanting to say to you before you leave the base. The colonel shuffled through some papers that were in front of him and selected a set of onion skin sheets that were stapled together. Your flight training methods have been unorthodox, and they have been unorthodox, I'm told, since the Y you started teaching here. Walter Bowman said nothing. It's never wise to answer a ranking officer's question until after he's actually asked it, Walter silently reminded himself. I gather that you have felt cheated that you ended up here nursemaiding cadets through flight training for the duration of the entire war. The colonel was staring at him with intense scrutiny. It must grate on you that you'll likely never find out whether or not you really have what it takes to be a fighter pilot when the targets are shooting back with live ammo. You got that one right, Bowman thought. His lips compressed at the stinging words, but he remained silent. The colonel had accurately assessed the inner frustration he had felt for much of the past 2 years. I don't know how you would have done overseas. My inclination is that a man who doesn't think an inverted spin 500 feet from the ground is anything too hard to handle would probably be able to keep his wits about him in the face of tracer fire and flak. But maybe not, and not knowing is something that every soldier who never sees combat has to live with. He looked at the paper in his hand. I had my adjutant look into a few things for me, things that involve you, he said pointedly. Would you care to tell me, Lieutenant, how many cadets you have trained on this air base? Lieutenant Bowman spoke for the first time. I don't know exactly, Colonel. I've been here 3 years. I'd say it must be over 100, sir. The colonel stared at the stapled pieces of paper. You have trained 437 airmen, Lieutenant. That is slightly more than twice as many as the next busiest flight instructor on this base. I suspect you have a better estimate of the number of your students who have been injured or killed on this facility? None, sir. That's right. And the number of your students who have washed out of the flight program? David Hearns and Paul Warner, Bowman said without hesitation. Correct, replied the colonel, although he had not known the two cadets' names and was startled that the lieutenant remembered them. And the number of aircraft your students have damaged? 3, sir. 3 aircraft that, according to my records, were each repaired and returned to service within 48 hours. Not totally demolished. Not like. He scanned the pages until he found what he was looking for. 6 of Lieutenant Harrison's 83 students managed to do. He put the sheets back on his desk D, once again looked the young man in the eye. Lieutenant Bowman, after reviewing these figures, I did some more research. Or, more accurately, I told my adjutant to go do some more research for me. I asked him to find out how many of the airmen who have been trained on our base have seen combat, who their instructors were, and which of them have been shot down or killed while in their airplanes. The information I asked for is incomplete, but 2 facts have clearly emerged. Lieutenant, the percentage of your students who have seen air combat is higher than that of any other instructor at Pensacola. The percentage of your students who have been shot down is the lowest of any instructor here. He let his words sink in for a few moments before continuing. There is another thing that I think you should know. When Chief Jenkins arrived on this base as our oldest seaman, I did not want him. He had been given the choice of prison or the Navy, and I damn well thought prison would have been much more suitable. I was wrong. And I was wrong, I now believe, because of you, Lieutenant. Bowman raised an eyebrow reflexively, but said nothing. The colonel inhaled and chose his next words carefully. You have an ability, Lieutenant, to cause others to put forth their best possible work, to inspire them to levels of achievement neither they nor their superiors would have thought them capable. Our greatest military leaders exhibit that ability on the battlefield. I believe you have it as a teacher. I am telling you this for 2 reasons. First, although it is none of my business, I think you should give serious thought to pursuing a teaching career as a civilian. I frankly doubt that there will be the need for your flight instruction skills in a post-war setting, as we'll likely have more than enough trained pilots for all the aviation jobs available. I also think you would be rather bored ferrying cargo for some commercial venture. But your ability with students is not limited to future aviators, and I hope you'll continue to use your teaching gifts with others. Secondly, I'd like to make you Pensacola's new chief flight instructor and director of flight training if you're interested in staying on for a while. I don't know if any of your methods can be implemented on a base-wide basis, but I'm willing to listen to your suggestions. If you do decide to stay here, I want a written proposal as to how you would recommend flight training here be improved. The colonel saw that Bowman did not know if he was supposed to reply. Take a few days to think it over. Come by my office on Monday morning. Oh, and that reminds me, I'm authorizing a 4-day leave for you, effective immediately. It has come to my attention that there is an aircraft on this base which meets none of the Navy's stringent regulations for training aircraft. You are familiar with the plane I am talking about? Bowman's heart sank. Whatever was coming would not be good. Yes, sir, I am. This plane, I understand, is totally unsuitable for student use, is it not? That's correct, sir. It is, in fact, so overpowered as to pose a safety risk to all but expert pilots, and it has no suitability whatsoever for air combat. No, sir. In that case, Lieutenant, I am placing you in charge of disposing of this aircraft in such a way that it can no longer endanger the lives of anyone on this base. Report back here Monday morning when you have completed that task. Dispose of it, sir? In exactly what manner do you want me to do that, Colonel? The man ignored the question. Chief Jenkins has been making sure that the craft is airworthy. Go talk to him. You've got 4 days. That should be sufficient time to do the job. Dismiss, Lieutenant. Walter Bowman left the colonel's office feeling miserable. He walked a half-mile to the maintenance hangar where his plane was usually stored. It wasn't there. Bowman caught one of the mechanics and asked him where Anvil Jenkins was. He said, "If you came looking for him, sir, to check hangar 6. Thanks, Ensign. Why'd they move it to the paint shop, he wondered. He was still in a daze about the meeting with the base commander. He met Jenkins as the mechanic was coming out of hangar 6. Where's my bird, Anvil? Colonel says you've been getting it ready for me to dispose of it. The older man's face betrayed no emotion whatsoever. Figured it needed a few things if its days here were over, sir. Come on in and you can see for yourself. He held the door for the lieutenant. As Walter stepped through the doorway, Jenkins flipped a row of switches, and the inside of the hangar was lit up by a dozen floodlights. Lieutenant Bowman drew his breath in. Whatever he had imagined, he had never expected this. There stood his steerman, but he hardly could believe it was the same airplane he had flown only a week before. The prop hub was no longer exposed. It was now covered with an aluminum spinner polished to a mirror finish. The big radial engine was also covered with a beautiful cowling to further streamline the front of the airplane and duct cooling air over the cylinders. The entire aircraft gleamed as he had never seen before. It was also no longer yellow. The clipped-wing steerman had been thoroughly wet-sanded and repainted entirely. It was now white, with dark green sunburst stripes on the wings and 2 thick longitudinal stripes of the same color on each side of the fuselage. On the side of the fuselage behind the cowling was a rendition of a nude, voluptuous woman. She was contorted into an impossible position, with a startled look on her face. Beneath her figure was the caption, "Every which way." Below the aft cockpit were the words, "Lieutenant Commander Walter Bowman," painted in black with a gold shadow line. On the engine cowling, and in much smaller lettering, was written, "Tuned by Jenkins Engineering." "Had a harder time than I expected getting an exact match on the green," the mechanic said, deadpan. He had painted the biplane in the school colors of Bowman's alma mater, Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. Bowman was speechless. Finally he found his voice. "The cowling," he said, his voice trailing off. "Now that took a while. Told you I was a hammerman, though. Took me a day or 2 to think it through. My aluminum welding is a sight better now than it was when I cut the material for it. Those blister MPs over each knuckle on the rocker covers made them by building a fixture in a steel die I made on e-mill, then rigged up a rubber diaphragm and forced grease into it under pressure. Pressure formed 'em that soft aluminum pretty as you please. The spinner, Jones made that for you. Told me he knew a girl CK home with titties just the right shape, and almost as big, and he said he'd copy one from memory. He teased so excited when he was done I half-spected him to knock out another one so's he could have a pair. Reeson did the artwork and lettering. Seems he's a mite tired of using nothing but stencils like on everything else around here, so I give him a free hand, sir. Hope you ain't offended." Bowman just shook his head. All that work. Bowman was thinking of the tremendous effort the men in E maintenance shop had gone to just to let him fly the steerman to some Navy boneyard for dismantling. Lieutenant, every man in the shop knows about the numbers the colonel was asking for. Hell, Colonel's aide got some of them from us. We did our own figuring and come up with the fact that you saved this shop one major shitload of work with all the planes them kids had sideways and you managed to get back on the ground with nothing bent. This here extra work weren't as much time as fixing the mess made by just one ground loop. The mechanic motioned Bowman over to the side of the steerman and moved on to a different subject. Now take a look at this, Lieutenant. You got a temporary ferry tank I rigged up in the front hole. Should be good for 2 extra hours if you don't goose the throttle too often. And back here, he said with a voice tinged with pride, is a couple things this bird has needed ever since we got her finished. Did a little horse trading to get 'em. He led the officer to the aft cockpit and pointed to the instrument panel. A new airspeed indicator had been installed, one which read all the way to 300 knots. I gave it the best calibration I could. When Anderson follows you in the SNJ, you can double check it. 300's a pipe dream, but let me know how fast my motor can pull this thing. Next to the airspeed indicator was an instrument that was entirely new. It was a G meter, and it was calibrated to plus 12 and minus 8. Knowing you might peg this one, Lieutenant, Jenkins said, tapping its glass face. But they won't make one that goes any higher. Probably don't have any equipment strong enough to calibrate it. A ferry tank and a G meter? What the hell for, anvil? Walter Bowman's voice showed his absolute bewilderment. Jenkins finally realized what the young man had been thinking, and an exaggerated look of OU age came over his weathered face. Jesus fucking Christ, Lieutenant. You think you're going to take this screamer to some scrapyard out on the Palmetto Flats and let a bunch of friggin' lop-eared kids cut her apart with a Mexican speed wrench? Whole maintenance shop would mutiny, but not before they cut your heart out and took turns pissing in the hole. R, he finished, his voice slightly more subdued. Then, Bowman said, distracted by the older man's creative outburst, Sir, Anderson's all set to follow you up to St. Louis and play taxicab. What? Damn right, sir. This bad girl was built just for you. You're taking her home.